Dane copyright 2018. Previously titled Hidden Uriel. This book is a work of fiction. The names, characters, places, and incidents are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemble to actual events, business establishments, locales, or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of both the copyright owner and the publisher. The only exception is brief quotations in printed reviews. The scanning, uploading, and distribution of this book via the internet or via any other means without the permission of the publisher is illegal and punishable by law. Please purchase only authorized electronic editions and do not participate in or encourage electronic piracy of copyrighted materials. Your support of authors' rights is appreciated. Published in the United States of America. Copyright 2018 Victoria Pinder Love in a Book. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Uriel Dalligatti, Harvard professor, checked the time on his pocket watch. It had a tiny triangular remnant of the hidden pyramid he'd helped uncover on his last dig in Cairo embedded at the 12. The gloomy winds of winter in Cambridge, Massachusetts blew past the glass windows where he taught Archaeology 101 to students looking to get out of a science credit. He would much prefer solving a historical mystery out in the field, but his tenure meant teaching, and the squeak of his black soles against Harvard's wooden floors echoed his resentment as he headed into class. He ignored the students, who sometimes assumed he was one of them, until he began his lecture, when his knowledge of the subject overcame his youth. He kept his watch open on the podium and waited for the minute hand to hit the 11. Lecture over. He closed the watch and said, "Class dismissed." Now he could return to his research paper and fill out the forms for his next sabbatical in the spring, Newfoundland in Canada, to continue the search for remnants of Viking settlements. However, as he made his way across the room toward the door, a young girl with black eyeliner jumped in his way. "Professor, students." The worst part of being faculty wasn't getting into the dirt but grading. He nodded, dodged around her, and held the door. "The 10 pages are due next class, but I was hoping for an extension." She stayed hot on his heels. At the end of the corridor, he saw his co-worker, Dr. Brady Booker, a colleague and friend, almost running in his direction. Uriel eyed the young girl. "Life doesn't give us extensions." She put her lips out in a pout. "But Professor, see you next class." He saluted and rushed down the hall, eager to get away from her emotional outburst. As he met Brady, he ran his hand through his hair and wished he had already filed the papers for his sabbatical, or had a secretary who filled out forms for him so he could just pack and start on his next research project. Anything would be better than being here. Brady, a young computer scientist who was also newly tenured faculty, turned and walked next to him. "I was waiting for your class to end. We have to talk." Uriel's mind switched on, and for the first time today, his coworker had never looked for him in the halls, so something exciting must have happened. They exited the building and stepped into the autumn air. Red leaves rustled on the trees from the cold wind that was ushering in the change of seasons. "I'm glad to see you, Brady. What a surprise." Brady stayed beside him as they crossed the barren lawn. The dark sky gave no hint of ending the bitter cold, and soon the colors would all just fade away. "I didn't expect to be here. You have some interesting visitors from the CIA. Strange." Uriel opened the door to the archaeology department, taking the second interior door on the right. "The CIA?" He entered his cluttered domain. 2 men in black raincoats stood and took off their felt hats. Uriel ignored the adrenaline that rushed through him and turned toward his friend. "Why are they in my office?" "Mr. Uriel Dalligatti." The blue-eyed older man had skin so pale he'd bet it hadn't seen the sun in years. Uriel pushed his pocket watch in his side pocket of his tailored jeans. "That's me." The second man, an African-American fellow with a Georgian accent and a dark gray suit, asked, "Do you also know a Dane Pearce?" Uriel's entire body stilled. He'd done everything he could to not be Dane. He met his friend's gaze with a casual shrug. "Brady, let me talk to the officers alone." The always amiable Brady smiled and held the door handle. "I'll wait for you outside in the hall." As Brady shut the door, Uriel asked, "Can I see your badges?" His mind raced. No one needed to remember Dane. Both men showed their badges, which seemed legitimate. Uriel didn't move until he heard the handle click, and then he walked over and locked it. He'd spent years trying to forget his past, and it wasn't something he wanted his friends to know. Once he was sure no one could hear him, he turned toward the 2 officers and asked, "Why is the CIA interested in Dane?" The older white man motioned for them to sit. Uriel took his seat behind his desk as the man sat in one of two chairs opposite the desk. Dane Pearce inherited a safety deposit box that we think holds the Irish crown jewels. He realized that the CIA had tracked him down and dispensed with games. I have? He immediately assumed this had to do with his murderous father. Technically, Edmund Pearce was his stepfather, but Uriel hadn't known that until the day his mother had died at Edmund's hand. His biological father had been sent to jail for a crime he hadn't committed. Could Edmund Pearce have knowingly kept stolen property that would have bought him a place in European nobility if he'd returned the crown jewels? It would be one more crime to add to the others. Greed. Surely his stepfather must be burning in an afterlife, if such a punishment even existed. In a soft accent, the younger officer leaned on the desk and pounded it lightly. You admit to being Dane Pearce. I filed for my name change through the courts, which is, I assume, how you found me. Uriel glanced at both men. Neither should think he'd had anything to do with a crime that had happened over a century ago. He adjusted his chair and pretended to be comfortable. Changing my name isn't a federal charge, officer, and my father isn't someone I want to associate with. The younger man went to say something else, but the older agent put his hand up, nodded, and then said, We're not here about your name, but we'd like your help in returning the Irish crown jewels to England as a goodwill gesture. Uriel had always liked figuring out mysteries, and though not archaeology, the Irish theft had been one of the most expensive heists in history. He folded his hands on the desk. They were stolen in some homosexual scandal with the vicar. How would Edmund Pearce have what was probably sold off in Amsterdam in 1907 and never recovered? The younger officer straightened and smoothed his jacket. We believe one of your father's ancestors bought the set in auction in 1907 and has kept them in a Paris bank until World War II, when they were placed in a London bank. The Irish crown jewels would technically be English, and if they were located in London, this seemed like a UK problem. Uriel picked up a pen that had fallen off his desk and set it back in the cup holder. Why haven't the London police just raided the box and taken back their stolen goods? The older man explained. The trail doesn't have a lot of evidence to back it up. His pale cheeks turned pink, which meant they didn't have a warrant to technically raid something he'd inherited. He wanted no part of the theft or jewels. No, it probably wouldn't. He stood to show the CIA officers out. If they were right and he owned this box, he'd discover the contents on his own time. First, he needed to finish the paperwork and head to Canada. The two men also rose, but then the older agent asked, Do you know a Ted Vetsan? Ted, the blonde man in his 30s whose scarred face made him seem much older, loved to torment him, taunting Uriel, spreading rumors, saying that Uriel would never truly be a great archaeologist. He could ignore all of that, but weeks ago Ted had stolen the Incan statue destined for a museum in Peru, then disappeared. Uriel widened his stance with a curt nod. Yes, I know him. Why? The African-American agent flicked the cuffs on his dark gray suit. His accent deepened. He tried to break into your father's box and is now likely going to wherever you stored this necklace, as it's supposedly the key. They knew about that necklace. The officer took out his phone and showed him the rose garland, which was 5 blossoms with pave-set diamond petals, old-cut diamond collet stamens and emerald detail, linked by pave-set diamond twigs and leaves enhanced by emerald berries, mounted in platinum. He'd inherited the piece after his mother's murder and it wasn't famous stolen jewelry. His entire body was cold. On Emily's prom night he'd given that to her in lieu of traditional flowers as she'd admired it. Emily Mira's blue eyes still haunted him years later, though he hadn't been in touch since. Something zipped inside him that he now had an excuse to see her. My mother's necklace. Do you have this in your possession? The older agent asked. Uriel narrowed his gaze. Why would that matter? A hint of pink flushed his face. We believe Ted is on his way to the US with a team of his people to retrieve the necklace. His pulse skipped. Emily was in danger. This was all his fault. His chest ached so badly that he felt like the Tin Man about to get a heart. He lifted his chin. I'm not saying another word until I know what you want, the older man said. Our country is willing to pay you for your private property. Just compensation was part of the Constitution, so they weren't offering anything special. He looked at both officers. And you want to give it back to England? Yes. The younger man pocketed his phone inside the gray suit jacket. Okay, I'll help, but I need information. And if Ted was on his way to Emily, then he needed to extract her from any danger, which meant see her again. His hairs on his arms stood straight up. What does the Belle Epoque diamond and emerald Ecolantine necklace created by Cartier have to do with the bank? The younger man shrugged and drawled in a low voice. It's the key. You need to present this as a means to get in the bank box. What happened to pins, fingerprints, eye retina scans, and modern security? Uriel thought a necklace seemed like a silly answer for security. The older man answered, this was arranged long before computers. The bank honors its agreements, though if you show up with the necklace, they'll want you to update your security settings. We believe Ted Vet-san is actively trying to take it from wherever you stashed your necklace as we speak, so he can access your vault and steal the Irish crown jewels. The CIA certainly knew a lot about his box, more than he did, but the necklace didn't matter. First he'd save Emily, get his mother's necklace, and then head to England and open the box himself. If they were right, he'd give it to the CIA or directly to the British Crown. The English crown jewels would be displayed and he'd have helped solve a crime from over a century ago. All he needed to do was be fast. But he had his own jet. What he'd say to Emily was the only question, but for now he nodded. I'll have to beat him then. I'll call you once we return. Without another word, he left the officers in his office behind him and motioned toward Brady, who often traveled with him on sabbaticals to handle computer scans and modern questions regarding archaeology. Brady had been sitting patiently on a wooden bench in the hall and clearly texting with Henry about going on another adventure to stop Ted Vet-san. Brady, let's go. Where are we going? Brady asked as the two men walked back out into the cool fall air. Emily, in an emerald green silk prom dress, floated to his mind. To Gainesville, Florida. Brady wore the look of horror that only a true Harvard professor might have for even mentioning a public university. What's there? I thought we needed to go to London for something already in your possession. Brady had obviously listened to the conversation in his office. Would he say anything? If Uriel could keep his past a secret from his colleagues, then no one might judge him as the son of a man whose father murdered his mother. Uriel directed them toward his black Mercedes. I don't know what's in that box. I'll go find out for the CIA, but first I need to get the necklace back. You don't have it. Brady opened his own door. Once Uriel was in the driver's seat, he asked, what did you do with it then? Uriel started the car, and for the third time in broad daylight he had another memory of Emily and her warm, inviting kiss. He shook it off and focused on the road as he drove. I gave it to a woman. His friend laughed and laughed like Uriel had just told him the punchline of a joke. He even held his stomach as he asked, what woman ever turned your head, Uriel? Right. His hands clutched the steering wheel. This was too much. He swallowed, and his face stung from an imagined slap Emily might give his cheek. Leaving after her prom night was probably not the nice guy move he'd mastered in later years. Emily had been there the day his mother died, and she was probably the reason he'd lived through it. She deserved better than anything he'd offer. He turned on his blinker and headed toward the airport. Right now he needed to face her at least one more time. One from a long, long time ago. She's not going to be happy to see me again. Brady stopped laughing. Well, try some charm, Uriel. You're handsome enough, but you never try to just smile at women and start conversations. Your one-night stands are something I've never understood. You literally do nothing to attract women, and yet they follow you around, like that poor girl you left crying in the hall. Nothing isn't going to work with Emily. Uriel felt the air drain from his lungs. Emily had every reason in the world to slam the door in his face and tell him to leave. He owed her his life, and he'd taken advantage of her in exchange. He never should have claimed her virginity, or her kisses, all those years ago. She deserved far more, and he hadn't even offered friendship in return. Now she was in trouble, and it was because of him. He'd make this right and disappear from her life, fast. It was the best thing he could do. Chapter 2. Emily Mira adjusted her black graduation hat and proudly flounced her blue tassel as she stepped from her red Jeep Wrangler. She smoothed any wrinkles from her short, same blue as the tassel, dress and walked toward the bar a block away. Everyone at the bar would know she'd graduated today. She and her friends had big plans of pictures with their caps that they'd only wear once. She'd finished her PhD and never had to work on her thesis again. As she headed toward the nightclub to meet her friends, she hummed to herself. She imagined her mother Monica in heaven, happy with Emily on graduation day. If she'd lived and hadn't died in a car accident when Emily had been 15, she'd have been proud. Real life began soon though, as college ended. No more scholarly papers on history. She'd even passed her real estate license. No one would call her doctor, but at least being a realtor brought in money until she found that faculty position she craved. It was time to stop getting degrees no one cared about except her. Tonight though, that didn't matter. This was about celebrating. Emily held open the door of the club and immediately smelled the alcohol. Her sister's husband Michael had always taught her to be safe. So as she stepped inside, Emily checked her pocketbook. She had her fake jewels and the sleeping pills that dissolved in alcohol in case she needed to escape someone who might have used some sort of date drug. None of her friends spent their breaks away from college learning defensive training from an overprotective brother-in-law, who also doubled as a second father in her life. But she was grateful that he cared. Her friends stood at a table with drinks already ordered, and she headed straight for them. She hugged the dark-haired and feisty Maria, about to be a resident at the University of Colorado in Denver Hospital, Florencia, an accountant with a nose for numbers, and Carla, who was now a lawyer about to clerk at the Supreme Court in D.C. Every single one of them had amazing careers before them. Everyone but her. Emily would figure out her life, eventually. She fingered her gold necklace as she looked at the drink menu. The moment a waitress stopped, she ordered a white mojito and let the necklace fall. Carla tugged her hand and gestured everyone toward the dance floor as she said, "Emily, this is going to be so much fun. Don't look so sad." "Let's dance," Emily followed, her mood bittersweet. Tonight they danced and drank for the last time. Who knew when they'd all be together again? Emily swayed with her friends to a fast song. Florencia asked, "Are you going to miss us when you move to Miami to be a realtor?" Emily refused to cry. She smiled and flipped her hair like it was part of her dance routine. "Of course, you three have such amazing careers ahead of you. You will too," Carla said loyally. Maria tapped her arm and whispered as she pointed to a man with blonde hair and blue eyes. "That guy is clearly looking at you, Em. He's not even cute." Emily quickly pursed her lips as she discreetly checked the guy out. He was at least 20 years her senior judging from his weathered skin, and she wasn't about to hook up with a man going on 50 when she'd literally just turned 28. No thanks. She continued to dance with her friends. Hopefully he'd get the hint if she looked away. However, her friends parted like they were the Red Sea and the man was Moses. He leaned close and she smelled cigarettes on his clothes. He held out his phone and showed her a picture of her younger sister in high school. "Miss Mira, can I speak to you? It's about your sister Isabella." Perhaps she'd read the man wrong, though a cold sense washed through her as she pointed the man to her table, away from her friends on the dance floor. "Oh, sure, let's talk over there." Without a word he followed. She picked up her mojito that had been delivered and sipped as he said, "Miss Mira, that's an interesting necklace you're wearing." This necklace had started many conversations since Dane had given it to her to wear for her high school prom. She'd not seen or heard from him since, but that night was one of the sweetest she'd ever had. She put her drink down and shrugged. "It's kind of a family treasure. Now what about my sister?" The man looked over his shoulder at two other men near the door and then asked, "You consider Uriel Dalligatti family?" Who? Her mind went blank. The last name was familiar from somewhere, but she'd never met a Uriel. The name rhymed with one of her favorite cartoon characters, so she wouldn't forget it. The man motioned with his hand. The two other men had grown to 4 associates, all menacing in their stance as they took out guns and raised them high. Patrons of the club screamed and ran toward the door. Her graduation cap tumbled off her short blonde hair, but it didn't matter. Her heart beat fast as he clasped his hand on her arm and again showed his phone to her. "Look, this is your sister Isabella." "Yes. Why?" She pulled her hand back. Her friend Carla had made it to the door with the crowd. Carla held up her phone and said 911 and then ran with the others to safety outside. Her other two friends were not as lucky. Florencia and Maria now had guns pointed at their heads as they clutched each other. The man held his phone next to his wrinkled face. "She will die by my hands if you don't give me that necklace." Isabella wasn't here in Gainesville. She lived with their sister and Michael, finishing her last semester at University of Miami in the spring with a business degree and interning at Michael's company. Her ears buzzed from the screams inside the club, but this man, even with his guns, was no match for her brother-in-law. She shook her head and said, "You clearly don't know my brother-in-law if you think that threat will work." Most times, Michael had said, men with weapons were bluffing, but you had to be prepared for when they weren't. The man put his phone in his pocket and said, "So you won't give me the necklace?" Dane, even though he'd left her, somehow still mattered to her. Sure, she'd only known him 2 years of her life, but she'd never forget his kisses or the verbal sparring lessons. Her fingers gripped her glass. She needed to get out of here, like Carla. She released her hold on the drink and shoved the table at him, and when he wobbled, she kicked him away from her as she ran toward the door in a full-out sprint. Guns clicked and the man called behind her, "What about your friends?" She turned to see him nurse his chin as he snapped, Do you have the same faith that they will be safe? Her heart beat a mile a minute. She never should have come out tonight. Emily clasped her hands together. Who are you? He walked over to her and she shrank while coldness enveloped her as he said, My name is unimportant. You'll never see any of us again if you give me what I want. Her friends mattered more than Dane's memory. He'd left her behind. Her hands reached for the necklace, but her fingers trembled around the difficult clasp. The man took this as weakness, and as he touched her bare arm, she immediately twirled, and in a smooth move she held his arm behind his back, just as her brother-in-law had taught her. And you've underestimated me. The man growled an order, and a gun popped off. Florencia screamed, Maria! Emily turned back and saw one of her best friends now lying on the floor bleeding. The man tugged at his arm to be released as he said, Your friend didn't have your talent. Sweat formed on her forehead. The necklace wasn't this important. She reached behind her neck with one hand as she shouted, You won't get away with this. The man pulled his arm free. Just give me the necklace, Emily, and you can get her to the hospital. Her free fingers grasped the clasp as she said, the curly-haired girl, he ordered. Another pop sounded in the air. Emily's entire body froze except for her heart that pumped faster than lightning flashes in a storm. No, leave Florencia. She's bleeding. Be faster, Miss Mira. Fine, I need 10 seconds, it's stuck. She pushed away from him and her hands shook with nerves as she unclasped the latch. Back away, Emily, Dane's voice echoed through the nightclub. She turned toward the sound that came from the back of the shadowed space and met the gaze of her dark-haired rescuer, who now had the bulging muscles of a man instead of the boy who'd given the necklace to her. For a second she was back in his arms, still a teenager, and at the prom instead of here, in this silent nightclub as victims stifled their tears. Dane stood there like an avenging angel that just appeared out of nowhere. She blinked and suddenly he was behind her, pulling her away. Another man, dark blonde, tall, lean but also muscular, who wore glasses, stood beside him and easily chased the 4 men who shot her friends away from the dance floor. They ran into the crowd outside. Without thinking, she latched onto him and said, Dane. He blocked her from the old man as he backed her out of the club into a back alley. The second the door closed and they were alone, she swallowed. Inside the club, her friends were lying on the ground. She needed to help them. Dane held her waist. Did he get the necklace? No. She held up the gold necklace he'd given her years ago. He reached for her palm as he said, Hand it over. Without thinking, she took her necklace back and easily wrapped it around her neck as she said, I need to get my friends to the hospital. The dark night now flashed red and blue as sirens screeched in the air. He hurried her toward a black Bentley parked in the back. The ambulances are already here. I called before I came for you. At least her friends had a chance. She swallowed and hopped in the back seat of his car. This friend sat with the driver up front. She looked at all 3 of them and instantly had the sense these men worked together as she worried about her own friends. Do they know to go inside? Yes, I reported guns fired before it happened. Dane closed the door behind himself. The driver took off, fast. Near Dane, she wasn't so cold and frightened that she'd freak out. Instead, she took his familiar hand in hers, and prom night flooded her mind. At 18, after the night where he'd danced with her under the stars, she'd asked him to take her virginity and he'd obliged in that hotel room he'd rented for them. None of that mattered as the car raced toward the highway. She pulled her hand back and narrowed her gaze. Why? I had to come back for you. He leaned closer, sending a familiar thrill through her, and his gaze was on her neck as he said, I knew they were coming for you. She sat back and pushed on his hard muscular chest to get him to give her space. As he followed her unspoken order, she lowered her gaze and said, Thank you, Dane. Then she stared directly into his eyes without blinking or looking away. But why didn't you call me and tell me not to go out? He scratched the back of his neck, flexing his muscles underneath his black shirt. Would you have listened? Her face heated. Would she have obeyed a directive from Dane to stay inside even for her own good? She was so mad at his desertion all those years ago that she would have gone out to spite him. Probably not. He held her hand to his chest where his beating heart was pressed against her palm. I need my necklace back, Emily. Her fingers brushed against his hard muscles while she took her hand back and shook her head. Absolutely not. Why are you always so difficult? They turned toward the airport exit, the Bentley zooming. There was the boy she remembered. She crossed her legs, not caring. Her blue dress went higher onto her thighs and fingered the necklace that accented her low-cut dress like they were still teenagers and she could tease him without consequences as she asked her most pertinent questions. Why do you need this so bad? Who are those guys? What's going on? Where have you been the past 10 years? He pursed his lips and motioned with his head to the two men in the front seat as they drove to the valet parking of the airport. I can't answer that here, right? She wasn't giving him the necklace. They slowed to a stop and Emily slid out of the car. Then I'm coming with you. You're going to the hospital with your friends. He joined her on the sidewalk. With Dane, she was her younger self again. She flipped her hair to her side and shrugged as she turned toward the airport. You're clearly in trouble. As I said, I'm coming with you. You're always so difficult. He fell into sync beside her. They stepped inside and the cold rush of air conditioning hit her in the face. Goosebumps grew on her body as she bumped into him and more quietly said, "And loyal, which is something you don't seem to understand. Or want, Emily." He led her toward the private plane section of the tarmac. She knew the area. Her sister Sophie had married Michael, a self-made billionaire, who had his own planes at his disposal. Michael also happened to be Dane's father. Dane might have walked away from him, but he clearly still enjoyed the affluent lifestyle both his fathers lived. They passed security and his two co-workers joined them. Now that is the biggest lie I've ever heard from you, the driver said. Uriel, did you get the necklace? She stopped mid-stride. The man at the nightclub, her necklace. She blinked. How had she not put this together? She swallowed and asked, wait, you're Uriel Dalligatti? His gaze narrowed as he took her hand, guiding her forward now as he asked, why? She picked up the pace and scooted closer. Dane felt familiar and warm. Her cheeks heated as she lowered her gaze. The old guy in the club, Ted Vetsan, he interrupted. And he looks older than he is. They made it to the wing with the private planes. Soon they'd have to walk out on the tarmac. She blinked as she met the one man's gaze that always stirred her in ways no one else ever had, no matter what his name was. What? His name is Ted Vetsan. He stopped. She crossed her arms, stopping too. Teddy in there was asking for you. Uriel. Dane focused on her neck. If she hadn't worn this tonight, would Ted and his minions have broken into her apartment and just stolen it? She pressed her lips together as she waited for his explanation. Dane traced her hip. He wants the necklace. Why? She ignored the heat that grew inside her and pushed his hand away. His two associates headed on to the plane jetway, while she and Dane remained in the terminal. She wasn't budging without answers. He lowered his voice. It's the key to opening a bank box. His warm breath brushed her face. It was like they were completely alone for the first time in ages, until the bustle of people moving in the terminal shook her out of the reverie. Don't they usually use pins and personal ID? Dane's forehead pressed against hers and they shared the same air again as he whispered, like it pained him. Edmund Pearce's family set this up specifically, and that necklace is the key. Her brow furrowed as he stepped back and the space between them widened. She pursed her lips and asked, have you talked to Michael? I'm not talking to or about my biological father. Dane's demeanor darkened. My life is my own. Right. Dane had thought Edmund Pearce had been his father until the day that man killed his mother in front of all of them. She winced at the memory of flying bullets. She'd only been 16. Edmund had also condemned Michael to prison. Michael had escaped and returned home only to find out Edmund had also stolen his unborn son. Edmund was a horrible person who deserved his early demise. Emily crossed her arms and met Dane's gaze. You probably should call Michael, as these men are dangerous. Instead of listening, he shook his head and stared at her throat. I should never have given you that necklace. More people passed them. She turned toward the jetway and kept her voice low as she said, you did it because you liked me once. At the entrance, he held her arm in earnest. Emily, you've always been too much. Just give it back to me now and we'll go our separate ways. You should also remember that I don't give up on what's mine. She pushed him off and then showed him the necklace around her neck. This is mine, tell me. Why do you need to go to a bank and why is someone chasing you? He blocked her, his muscular arms almost ripping through his black t-shirt, his chiseled legs in custom blue jeans, him towering in front of her so she couldn't pass. I think you need to give me the necklace and go home. She patted his shoulder and waited for him to move. After several moments, he finally did and she smirked. Nice try, now I'm going with you and you're going to answer my questions. He threw his hands in the air like he'd given up. You were always bossy. As she went down the jetway, she saw his personal jet that could double as a passenger plane. They were clearly going straight across the Atlantic to London without stopping. She stepped on the tarmac. You never complained, besides you need me. He followed her and asked, why do I need you? I just need the necklace. She hurried up the metal stairs. At the galley, she picked up a bottle of wine, a corkscrew, and 2 glasses, then headed toward seats midway of the aircraft. He took off his suit jacket and hung it over the chair. Once he sat next to her, she handed him the glasses while she kept the bottle. "Because you know you can trust me and I'm on your side. You need friends and I'm the best one you ever had." The other 2 men were out of sight and she assumed they were in the cockpit. Dane held the glasses between his legs. "Which is why I don't want you hurt because of me." For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged to something and she didn't even know what was going on. She pierced the cork and twisted. "You can protect me by telling me what's happening." "Fine, let me pour." He took the bottle from her and pulled out the cork. Today had been the strangest day. Now that they were alone, he could tell her everything. Her body was alive and she was back with Dane. Whatever happened, she was here to help. Chapter 3. Grabbing the wine had probably made her seem confident, Emily thought. Sitting next to Dane sent a pulse through her body that made long dormant parts of her come alive, and she needed 10 seconds to catch her breath. Emily had always been cool and confident with Dane, and somehow, her sassy side came right back. For the past few years, her studious side, the one that didn't retort with an opinion that wasn't fully researched, was the Emily everyone saw, even her friends. Maybe it was her sparkling blue nightclub dress that boosted her ego? She normally wore jeans and a t-shirt, with a cardigan, while she studied at the library. Dane poured the wine at the bar and she had a nice view of his tight backside. She knew for a fact he had them tailored. His black t-shirt seemed simple, but it was no doubt designer. He turned toward her and handed her a glass and her heart raced. Dane's dimples hit her like a sudden earthquake and made her body tremble. Holding the stem of her wine glass, Emily leaned closer to Dane as he took the seat beside her. He still smelled like warm nights on the beach where they'd watched the sunrise. She ignored the stirrings in her body, sipped the wine and watched the tarmac whiz by as the plane gained speed. "Who are the men you're with?" He put his glass down on the table in front of them without touching a drop as the plane soared in the air. Casual and relaxed, Dane tugged on his t-shirt like the collar was suddenly too tight, then nodded toward the cockpit. "Dr. Brady Booker, who works with me, and my butler, bodyguard, pilot and all-around handyman, Henry Kavana." The 3 men had worked like a well-trained unit in the club, so she sensed they had worked together for a while. Her heart sped fast near him, but she honestly had no idea where he'd been. His dark hair with thick curls had been cut super short, though she remembered his longer hair like it was just yesterday. She used to run her fingers through it when she'd kissed him. She gripped the armrests of her soft leather chair, and then gestured with her head to the wings of the private plane visible through the open windows. Clearly, Dane used his money he'd inherited, and his close proximity caused a small jolt inside her that she'd never admit to. Michael also employed a loyal man who'd taken a bullet for him. Emily smiled and asked, "When did you get your own Jack?" "Right after my first dig." Dane picked up his glass and drank before admitting, "Michael might have influenced my decision to seek out someone loyal to have around. Bad people know I'm rich." Had he been hurt? Not only had he inherited his stepfather's money, but he'd benefited from his real father's vast wealth too. Emily sighed and sipped her wine. "That you are, Dane." She'd earned her scholarships, though Michael had helped her financially throughout her years of education. Now she needed to earn an income and prove her worth. His nose curled like she'd insulted him. "Don't call me that." As they soared over the ocean, the craft bounced with turbulence until the plane steadied. She crossed her arms. "But it's your name." He took another sip and lowered his glass between his legs. "I changed it to Uriel when I left home." Out of all the names in the world, he'd chosen a strange one. She fluffed her short blonde bob, low-sighed, and scooted closer as she lowered her voice. "Where are we going?" He didn't move, and for one moment she could feel his skin on hers, though they didn't touch. His eyes dilated. Was his heart beating faster too? She licked her lips and closed her eyes, but he sat up like he'd been scolded. "London. You don't have your passport, so we'll send you home right away." She'd left her passport at home, not thinking she'd need it for dancing. Knowing it was a stupid idea, Emily wished they'd had that kiss. She tugged her short dress down a little. "You can get my passport ordered, just like your father can." Dane looked over her shoulder like he saw a ghost out the window when he said, "He's not my father." "Not really." Emily blinked and her entire body stilled as she recalled their first meeting so many years ago, as teenagers. She and her sisters had been hiding in the barn where Dane's mother had been shot by his stepfather, Dane Pearce, who had sent Dane into the barn with the same gun to set him up as his mother's murderer. Emily had kissed Dane to distract him from shooting either her sisters or Michael. She'd held Dane's hand while the truth was unveiled, and he'd dropped the gun in his own hand like it was a hot potato. The memory surged through her and she shook her head. So you want to consider the man who shot your mother a father? Dane held the glass between his legs so tight she wondered if he'd break it. Edmund raised me until I was 16. He's who I see when I close my eyes as the one that raised me, but father, I prefer to believe I never had one. Fair enough. Emily remembered her mom and never considered her older sister as anything other than that, though their two younger siblings more thought of Sophie as their second mother. Emily patted his arm, thick with muscle now. Interesting. I won't push on that one. His eyes flickered. Why does this Ted person want the necklace you gave me? He stared unabashed at the gold blossoms at her throat. I told you to hold it for me. She fingered it and lowered her head. You never took it back. He brushed his hand against her skin at the collarbone. I need it now. Wow. Every part of her body became aware of him. She pushed his hand away. Why? And give me specifics. He sat way back in his seat like he needed to escape from her. Apparently Edmund Pearce possesses the Irish crown jewels in a bank box. I'm going to retrieve it and give it back to the throne. They were stolen in 1907. Her body perked with interest. History was the one area that always appealed to her. She sipped her wine and waited for him to share the rest. Dane immediately leaned forward. How do you know that? Right. The girl he'd known had talked about getting her MBA and starting her own company, but in the end had retreated before the real world. Emily, the woman, needed to make money to survive. Michael and her sister had deposited a nice sum in her bank account in her name, but she couldn't very well live off their generosity forever. In college, history had been the one thing she'd really enjoyed learning. Emily put her glass down on the small table to her right and folded her hands in her lap. I have my doctorate in history and want to be a professor at some point. I've been applying for postdoctorate positions and faculty positions everywhere. He didn't move as he studied her in disbelief. She pressed her hand to her heart and ignored the heat in her face. For my master's, I wrote a paper on that particular theft and how the church was hiding the vicar's homosexuality. And that mattered more to the officials than retrieving the jewels, which is why they delayed reporting the theft until 1907, when officials from England intended to visit Ireland. She thought back to her research and surmised. The jewels were either taken to Amsterdam or Paris and sold there. If they still exist, it will be a surprise. Dane positioned his glass beside hers as he leaned into his headrest and turned to face her. Either way, Ted tried to break into my father's safety deposit box to help himself to the Irish crown jewels, or whatever is there. The older but not older man from the club. So the jewels were important. She'd known her own eglantine necklace, unique in style, with diamonds and emeralds set in gold blossoms, was worth a lot, and also from the same time period. She'd written papers on jewelry like hers, and missing sets of the Victorian age because of her own attachment to hers, as this was her only tie to Dane. And you're going to give them back to the royal family? Dane gazed at her neck and lower, and she had the distinct impression it wasn't her necklace that interested him. Aware of her blue party dress and the low cleavage, she reached for his coat jacket he'd slung over the chair and put it on. His woodsy cologne enveloped her, but he'd rebuffed her kiss so she'd be smart to shield herself. He looked away. Why not? It's not like I want them. If he hadn't shown up at the nightclub, she'd have just assumed he was out in the world causing trouble. But the smell, this jacket, his saving her from being shot and being all noble about returning the missing jewels, well, she sucked in her bottom lip and tried to deny that he still made her body tingle. Perhaps even more now that he was all hard muscles and not the boy she'd given her virginity to back on prom night. What do you do now, Dane? Uriel, he shifted on the leather seat. His scent washed over her as she tugged his coat around her body. Okay, Uriel, though it's going to be hard for me to think of you that way. When I dreamed about you, your name was Dane. His eyes widened. You dream about me, Emily? Dreamed, past tense. She sat up, alert against revealing how sappy he made her. She'd been fine on her own and didn't need him or anyone. Emily uncrossed her legs and her knee accidentally touched his. That doesn't answer my question. He gulped his drink and put the empty glass down as he stared at the lights on the ceiling of the plane. What question was that? So, he didn't want to tell her about himself? She reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pocket watch, like he was an old man and not 28. She put it back and asked, "What do you do? You mentioned digs, so are you an archaeologist?" A huge smile grew on his face like she'd just decoded a mystery. Yes, I don't just read books about the past like you do. I want to discover history for myself. Dane must have seen too many adventure movies as a boy, which was probably better than getting too close to his stepfather. as that man had been a psycho. She relaxed in her seat and stared at Dane's broad shoulders that seemed stronger and sturdier than the last time they'd seen each other. She smiled and said, "I assumed you were gambling and drinking your way around the world. No one heard from you in years." The plane began its descent, hours with Dane into the night, yet she didn't feel tired at all. He shrugged and pressed his head into the headrest. "Sorry to disappoint." Emily allowed herself to touch his chin and cheek. He'd also grown more facial hair, and it seemed he hadn't shaved in a few days. In school he'd been all about brand names and clean cut. The boy and the man collided in her eyes. "Just the opposite. I'm impressed, Uriel. You walked away from me and your family." He kissed her palm. "Michael is more your family than mine." And her skin was jumpy and achy for him as she took her hand back. She lowered her lashes and said, "He was good to me and my sisters." The plane landed in the airport. Dane, she couldn't think of him as Uriel, held the armrests as the plane slowed from its high speeds to cruise toward a stop. "Which is more than I can say about my mother and I." "That's not fair." Fog around London puffed outside the window behind him, masking the night that just made the darkness seem gray and dreary. She hadn't been here in years, and that was when her sister and Michael had taken the family on a trip to see history and not just read about it in books, as Dane had just said. Dane hadn't been there. He'd left too soon and spent most of that time at boarding school. The plane came to a complete stop. "It's probably not, but it's how I feel." "I get it. I was there." She refused to relive those moments where bullets flew past her head, though both times that had happened she'd been with Dane. As they disembarked, he took her elbow and stopped her, midway down the metal stairs. "You saved my life, which is why I should send you home right now." She winked at him and shook her hips a little as she took her hand back. "I'm not going anywhere but with you." They stepped off the plane to the tarmac and his two cohorts followed. A limo waited a few feet away. Dane opened the rear passenger door for her but stopped her from heading inside. "Swear you'll stay away from anything dangerous." Dane was sweet when he worried, but thanks to Michael she could take care of herself. She patted his stomach and sailed past him into the seat. "I will be careful." The moon and stars weren't visible in the night due to thick clouds around London that made visibility hard 2 feet in front of her nose. Dane told the driver the name of a fancy hotel, and despite her efforts to stay awake she dozed in the car. He guided her inside the hotel, but her head was fuzzy as they checked in. Separate rooms. So much had happened in the past few hours. She focused on the red carpet under her feet as they walked to their rooms. Dane stayed next to her as his men went into one room, mumbling goodnight. He escorted her to the next one. As she slipped her electronic card into the reader and the door opened, she said, "I'd like to see the jewels just once." "Why?" He made no sign of moving from her doorway. She patted his face again as she liked the ruggedness of his scruff under her touch. "It's the right thing you're doing. It makes me proud of you." He stepped into the hall and placed his hand on his heart. "You are too much, Emily." "For what?" She flipped on the light, holding the door open as she watched him. "Which is exactly why you like me." "Good night, Dane." "Uriel," he countered and returned to her side. Butterflies grew in her stomach as her eyes closed and her lips pursed. A moment later, she was still the girl she'd been and he was still that boy who'd kissed her and made her forget the rest of the world existed. His arms around her made her feel alive and able to be herself. No one else had a kiss that came close to his. As his hard lips left her slightly bruised and trembling mouth, she whispered, "You still kiss like Dane." He backed up and into the hall. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it. Dane Pearce, or Uriel Dalligatti, or whatever he called himself now. He'd filled her childish dreams of happily ever afters once. Clearly he still had something that rocked her to her core. Chapter 4. Uriel tucked his pocket watch into the front pocket of his indigo designer jeans. The bank opened in an hour, and they needed to be there before Ted. He slipped on his lightweight jacket as he imagined how the meeting might go. As soon as it was done, he'd send Emily home, where she belonged. The last thing either of them needed was more complication. They were far too deeply intertwined and on paper related. She'd be better off alone, the same as he was. He listened from the hallway outside her door and heard the shower running. The necklace he'd given her had looked like it belonged around her neck, but he needed to right the wrongs of the Pearce line. Torn, he used his extra key and let himself in. If he could leave her out completely, they'd both be better off. The shower behind the closed bathroom door ran and he quickly checked the safe in her closet, open and empty, then the drawers of her room. The necklace was nowhere. He closed the last drawer as the shower turned off and glanced up. Emily leaned against the open bathroom door, fully dressed in dark blue pants and a coordinating light blue and green blouse. with a flash of the diamond and emerald necklace under her collar. She crossed her arms and grinned knowingly at him. Dane, Uriel, what are you doing in my room? His eyes widened in surprise at being caught and heat rose to his cheeks. You're wearing the necklace in the shower? She sauntered over, tapping his shoulder as she took her phone off her charger and added them both to her pocketbook that perfectly matched her outfit. How she'd shopped was a mystery, but he didn't ask as she closed the bag and said, I didn't trust you, to be honest. It seems I was right. A smile grew on his face. She'd called him out. No one else had ever talked to him like she did, even though it didn't go in his favor. He opened the door and held it for her. Emily, I like being with you again. She stood in the hallway and waited for him to close her door and then brushed her hand against the necklace as she lifted her brow. Because I won't let you get away with trying to steal my necklace. Emily sashayed before him and he stared at her every curve. No other woman in these years had tasted anything as sweet as Emily. Her kiss had packed a punch when he was still just a boy, and the sway of her hips now made him think she might be the only woman to get under his skin. The bank could be dangerous and I want you to stay here. She hit the elevator button and stepped in front of him. I'm going, Dane. The doors opened and he had no answer to how alive she made him feel. She was like a wind that just swept in and woke him up as he followed her into the elevator. It was worth a try, let's go. The elevator smelled like Emily's perfume, soft and floral, as they rode down in silence. The doors opened and he briefly brushed against her arm, but she didn't wait. Brady and Henry rose from their seats in the lobby and Emily walked over with her hand out in greeting. Hi, I'm Emily Mira. Thank you for helping me get out of the club yesterday. I appreciate it. She then turned toward him and asked, Who is who of your associates? Right. If she was staying, then she needed to know everyone. He tapped his friend on the back. Emily, this is Dr. Brady Booker. She smiled at Brady, who grinned back, his metal-framed glasses reflecting the light. Emily turned toward his closest ally and nodded at Henry, who had a slight scar on his cheek like he'd lost a bar fight once. That makes you Henry Cavena. It's nice to meet you both officially. Brady offered his arm to leave the hotel. Emily accepted and continued to walk in front of him as they headed toward the limo waiting outside. Brady said, Uriel doesn't usually bring women on our adventures. She flipped her bobbed blonde hair and winked at Uriel as she stood near the limo. Adventures? When was the last one you boys had? Cairo, Brady answered. In the same moment Henry said, Hong Kong. Shaking his head, Uriel claimed, nowhere. Interesting. She ducked inside and the three men followed. Once Henry closed the door, she met Uriel's gaze and said, This morning at the bank will also be interesting. Brady and Henry kept quiet, as if staying out of what was happening between him and Emily. His plan was simple. London police and security were top-notch at the exclusive bank. So they'd go in, retrieve whatever he had in the box, and leave. Once he saw the jewels to see what they actually were, he'd call the CIA and fly out of London within the hour. Not that Emily knew that. Undaunted, Emily watched confidently out the window as if she belonged here, with him. With Emily, and only her really, could he remember being just Dane and not hating his life. Most of his teen years had been pure torture that he'd rather forget. All except the moments with her. The limo stopped and her shoulders bounced as they parked in front of the bank. She said, And we're here. She exited without waiting for the driver. Was she nervous? Excited? A cold wind brushed against him as he stepped out and studied Emily, who stood on the sidewalk already. She somehow glowed like the embodiment of life itself. He pressed his hand on her lower back and quietly said, Emily, give me the necklace now. I'll give it back once we're in. Her hands trembled, but she unhooked the clasp and met his gaze. Her lips were full as she said, Dane, stay with Henry. He clutched the necklace, unable to believe it was finally in his grasp. Now he needed to ensure she was safe. She brushed his hand off her back and walked toward the bank door with a simple word for him. No. Emily, he said while she reached for the door. He took the handle from her and held it open for him and the others. We don't have time. She motioned toward the desk behind a mahogany counter staffed with one man. Above him was a safety deposit box sign. The four of them headed over together, and he showed the necklace to the clerk, who asked him to sign in. Behind him he heard Brady ask Emily, How do you two know each other? Uriel took me to prom, Emily answered. Uriel glanced backward and saw how Emily bounced up and down as she smiled at him. His heart warmed as he signed his name in the ledger. The banker then waved for him to follow, and Uriel pressed his hand on Emily's back, urging her forward. Brady laughed and walked behind them as he said, "Ah, so you're why no other woman holds his interest for long." Emily made a sound with her tongue. The banker opened a private metal door with an electric access card, and Emily turned toward Brady and said, "That probably has to do with his wish to not get involved with anyone he might have to leave." What was she talking about? He let her go as the banker swiped the box in question and handed it to him. Brady asked Emily as the banker left, "What do you mean?" The door clicked and locked while Emily said, "After his mother died." "Oh, Emily, that's enough, we're in." He opened the box. She walked closer to him and looked down as he reached inside. Instead of jewels, he pulled out a piece of paper. Emily peered over his shoulder and said, "Let's see this box." He flashed the paper her way as he unfolded it and read the written coordinates on a map, and another slip of paper with a different bank box number. Seemed they were going on a scavenger hunt. This time they were heading to Paris, and a bank he remembered Edmund, the man he'd thought was his father, had gone to many times. Henry glanced at his phone and the security camera above the door. Ted Vetsan is in the bank upstairs with his associates. The box also had another blossom impression, this one smaller. His heart beat faster, but then he saw Emily's earrings she wore that matched the necklace. He held out his palm. "Emily, I need the earrings to your set I gave you." "My earrings too?" She unfastened them. He opened and closed his hand, aware of Ted too close. "Hurry. Here." She handed him the diamond and emerald flower mounted on platinum and gold. The rose earring matched the latch and he turned the lock. Once it clicked, he opened it and another box appeared. He took it as Emily said the obvious, "It's a box. Grab it and let's go." Henry braced himself against the front door they'd come in. "We're out of time." Emily held out her hand and did the same motion he'd done earlier. "Can I have my jewelry back?" He returned her earring and necklace, clasping her hand. "Put it on in the car." She made sure that her pocketbook was at her side while they raced down the hall the way they'd come. But Henry directed them to the back door. As they raced up, their footsteps like a marching army departing a battle. He stopped. On the top step, Ted pointed a gun at him. "Uriel." "Ted." He slipped the small box in his back pocket, maneuvering in front. He'd give his life for Emily and his friends to escape. Brady pushed Emily behind both of them as Ted said, "I won't let you leave with those jewels." Henry nodded and stepped further back with both Emily and Brady, but then Henry pulled out his handgun and leveled it at Ted. Brady pushed Emily to run with him the 4 feet to the back door of the bank, while Uriel remained before him. "You don't get a choice." Ted snapped his fingers and gestured for Uriel to look behind him. Ted's henchmen showed with their red lasers that they had a clear shot at Emily's head as she neared the back door. Ted said, "Pity, your girlfriend is rather pretty." Brady stepped in the way of the bullet as Uriel said, "Leave her out of this." Ted stared at her and said, "She possesses a treasure around her neck that is probably worth just as much as the fabled crown jewels." Emily stopped running and turned toward them. "Wait. If I give you this necklace, will you leave Uriel alone?" His heart dragged to a stop. They were so close to getting her out of here, and she ignored their work, passing Brady and Henry to stand next to him. His friends hadn't stopped her, but he would. He had to. He placed his hand on her arm and said, "No, don't." "Yes, of course." She reached for the clasp at her neck. "No." He threw himself on her and blocked her head while he ran toward the back door. Ted's man shot at them, but Henry jumped in front to block them. Brady held the door as Uriel raced Emily out as he said, "Go, fast." 2 thugs were right behind them as the limo he'd hired that morning came forward into the small alley behind the main street. Henry must have ordered him to move before they escaped. Uriel shoved her inside as she said, "Dane, don't stop, just go, Em." Ted wanted what he had more than Emily or her necklace. He slipped her the box and slammed the limo door behind her the second she stepped inside. He'd find another way to escape, so long as she was free. The driver pressed the gas, but she rolled down her window and shouted, "Just give him the necklace, Dane, and get inside, don't do this." And then Ted would chase her and she would be in constant danger. "No." He tapped the limo so the driver would keep going. "You don't understand." "No." The limo sped off. Dane stared at the retreating taillights. The small alley had once been cobblestones under the tar, and gray stones poked from the concrete. "Emily," he whispered, "I care about you, more than I should." The door behind him opened. "So how are we escaping?" Brady asked as he came beside him. The limo turned onto the main road. Near the bank door, Henry kept his gun focused on Ted, who remained inside. He nodded at a security officer in the bank. Once they caught up with Emily, everything would be fine. Uriel pointed to the main street for Brady and Henry to run with him. Two thugs spilled out next, then Ted, his gun trained on Henry, who must be out of bullets, because he wasn't firing his weapon. Uriel slowed down and turned. He'd not get his friends killed over this. He lifted his chin and met the chilly blue-eyed gaze of his nemesis. Ted, there were no Irish crown jewels in the safe. Your information and what the CIA told me was wrong. The trip isn't totally wasted. Ted put his gun down. Henry lowered his handgun, as did Ted's two associates. They wore black trench coats like they were gangsters in the 1920s. Uriel had a bad feeling in the face of Ted's confidence. You lost. Did I? Ted saluted him and strode forward, closing the gap between them. Less than a foot away, Ted said, "The limo driver works for me, Uriel." Ted shoved by him, and he and his thugs ran toward a van that pulled up onto the street behind them. Uriel's heart dropped to his stomach as he realized that he'd just put Emily into danger. How had that happened? Brady patted his back as Uriel visualized Emily in that monster's hands. Brady said, "Uriel, I'm sorry." Uriel swallowed and stood straighter. He was stronger and faster, so he ran as fast as he could, with his hands curled into fists. He chased Ted down the alley toward the busy street and his waiting van. If he didn't stop this, Emily could die. Henry appeared at his side, sprinting all out. What was in the security box? Brady panted as he joined them. You showed Emily, but I was near the door with Henry. He'd slipped the box to Emily, not that his friends knew that. Now wasn't the time to explain. 6 inches away. Ted and his 2 men were already in the black van. The engine revved. Uriel lunged for the back door, but the driver squealed the tires as he sped away. He leaned forward and dragged in deep breaths, not from exertion but fear for Emily. Now what? Do you know? Brady asked, taking his glasses off to wipe his forehead. Henry flagged down a taxi for them. Uriel said, "A map." As they climbed inside, Uriel let his friend read the paper he still possessed. Not that it explained anything. Brady handed it back. Interesting. It says the key is the necklace. Henry gave coordinates and the license plate of the limo to the driver. Air returned to his lungs and he wasn't numb. Saving Emily sent adrenaline through him as he told Brady that Emily has. As the taxi sped toward the limo, Brady asked, "Are we rescuing her or the necklace?" "Always Emily." Not that he'd say that. Henry coaxed the driver to go faster by promising extra cash. Soon the limo was in front of them. Uriel's muscles tingled with anticipation. "Emily, this is all my fault." Brady fixed his glasses, took out his phone and started typing in the numbers he'd seen on the slip of paper. A cool fact about his friend was that Brady had a photographic memory. "I see. I'll start searching these coordinates and get you the information we'll need." Uriel already knew they'd head to his father's bank, eventually. The taxi driver pulled beside the limo and Uriel rolled down his window. Without realizing that she was in danger, Emily glanced beside her and noticed him with a smile. When she saw how he waved frantically at her, she rolled down her window too. He said, "Emily." Then the limo driver pressed on the gas. She pulled on her door, but the driver had locked it. With a fast glance in front of her and then toward him, she threw the box to him as she began to climb out the window. The limo swerved and she fell back inside, on her seat. His heart beat wildly, unsure how he'd catch her, but he would if she tried again. He'd caught the box. She screamed out, "Dane, you." The wind and the speeding tires drowned out whatever she said. He opened his door and said, "What?" You," she said again as she struggled to her feet, her head out the window. The wind screamed between them. Squealing tires and road traffic made her voice disappear. "I can't hear you." She climbed onto her seat again and managed to get a leg out as he said, "Jump." Perhaps this wasn't the best plan. She clutched the necklace around her throat and her eyes widened as she asked, "Now?" "Yes." He held out his hands. If he could reach her, he could hold her. Something clicked in the air as they sped toward the train station. Henry tugged him down and said, "Get back here." A millisecond later, black smoke burned his eyes. What sounded like an engine exploded, and metal shrieked as the limo blew up, vehicle pieces showering from the air. He screamed, "Emily!" He coughed when his lungs filled with smoke. The blackness made his eyes water. Henry's hand tightened on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry. Emily deserved way more than me." Uriel had nothing else. The world was black without her. As the smoke dissipated, he saw fragments of the limo. Somehow she was gone, and he had no way to get her back from the dead. Chapter 5. Emily Mira's head pounded. She blinked and tried to figure out where she was. The click-clack sound underneath the chair, and the sway quickly told her mind train, though she kept her eyes closed. As she tried to move, she realized her hands were tied. Her skin was sensitive after the explosion inside the limo, but she didn't feel burned. She moved her head back and forth, and the weight of gold at her throat assured her she still wore her jewels. She should have switched the jewels out after the bank, but she didn't want to fake out the banker. In the limo, there hadn't been time once she understood she was in danger. She slowly opened her eyes. Coldness enveloped her as she looked into the blue depths of the man from the club. Her lips were dry, but not burned. "Where are we?" On a train. Ted sat back in his chair, studying her as he held a cigarette to his lips. A round table was between them. She wasn't quite sure what she'd say to this man. If she sounded too weak or too aggressive, what happened next? What would Michael instruct? She swallowed. "Untie me." He ignored her request, and made a point of time passing when he adjusted his seat. Picked up a glass of water, drank, put it down, smoked his cigarette, puffed it out, and then finally said, "Emily Mira, now that you're awake, you can tell us everything you know about Uriel Dalligatti." Michael would say that a man who stalls wants to show his position of power and hide his weakness. Who? Her mind whirled. She really should have asked Dane more questions about his new name and new life. Old feelings clouded her judgment, but she'd not betray him. She held the man's gaze. Ted leaned closer and she could smell tobacco on his breath and clothes. "Don't play coy." Goosebumps grew on her body. Emily needed to find her way out of this. She saw her pocketbook on the table near the private bar, and the other man Ted traveled with. The interior door was painted gold. "You didn't steal my necklace from me." He gave a smirk and another blast of cold air raced down her spine as he said, "If the bank needs proof of original ownership, we figure your social media photos with the various time-stamped dates might be enough." He showed her various photos of herself, wearing the necklace at different events over the past 10 years. She tugged her hands, handcuffed to the chair, and wished she could call him a stalker. "You found my pictures?" He put his phone down on the table next to his pack of cigarettes. "Yes, but I can't figure out how a Florida girl who spent years getting her doctorate at UF is related to the Harvard archaeologist. You aren't seen together in any of these pictures." Harvard? Dane worked there? Seriously? She had clearly been wrong about him. She'd always imagined some back room of Vegas and alcohol. She let out a snort and tried to bluff her way out of this situation. "Uriel and I don't know each other. We talked online about the Irish crown jewels after he read my article." Ted stood and trailed his hand across her necklace. So he flew to the rescue of the woman with the jewels he'd once possessed. This was why she never lied. She was no good at it. She laughed at her own ridiculousness and wished she was quicker at stretching the truth. "Oh, right, the necklace." Ted knelt down beside her and stared into her eyes. "You've had the jewels for a number of years." Right. Lying wasn't in her skill set, so she could try for the vague truth. She shrugged, letting her handcuffs rattle as she said, "My prom date gave them to me. It was a long time ago." He tapped his fingernails on the armrest of her chair and then said, "Uriel had no issues with ID at the bank." Tap, tap. Is Uriel Dalligatti related to Dane Pearce? Seconds away from revealing the truth, Emily winced and wished she could figure out a way to deflect Ted. She lifted her chin and said, "Who? You're a horrible liar, Miss Mira." The man traced her cheek with his scratchy, dry thumb. Revulsion grew in her stomach. She shook her head and his touch off her as she avoided his gaze. "You're right, I am. And Uriel hates me. He's always hated me." "I doubt that." Ted rose and took his seat, sipping his water. Her lips were dry and parched. She swallowed. "It's true. I was there the day his father killed his mother. I remind him of something he doesn't want to remember." "So Uriel is Dane." Ted didn't blink as he stared at her. If she acted like she cooperated, maybe she could find her way off the train. She leaned closer and nodded. "Absolutely. So, if I give you this necklace, you can let me go. I'll fly back to Florida and he can forget all about me." Again. Without any explanation, Ted stood and snapped his fingers at the other man. "I can't let that happen. Alexander, see if you can get her to talk about Dane Pearce until I get back." She watched Ted walk out of the small private room as the train continued on its tracks, making a light purr under her own tied feet. For a second she saw the plush red carpet of the main train. But the golden door closed and his footsteps disappeared from her hearing. The click of the door reverberated inside her gut. She'd use her years of defense training to get out of here. As the other man came over, Alexandra, she smiled at him, noticing his groomed face and hook nose. Her instincts whispered to be cautious, as if timid. For all she knew, talk meant threaten rape. She glanced down and asked, "Alexander, you're French?" "Oui." He sank onto the chair his boss had just vacated. "Alexandre Mazat at your service, madame." He thought himself a ladies' man. Maybe she could find her way out of this, with Alexandre's unwitting help. She licked her lips and coughed, lowering her lashes. "Look, Dane and I were high school, and that was a long time ago. I've not seen the man in 10 years and I don't want to. Not when I can talk to nice men like you. Why don't we sit peacefully and have a glass of wine while we talk? Wine always loosens me up." "Wine is an excellent idea." He stood. "Though it's better for you that we don't share too many personal details." "Why?" "My wife might be jealous," he teased. "Or I might have to kill you later." "Not good." She jingled her handcuffs. "I'll behave. The wine sounds yummy, but you'll have to untie my hands if I'm to join you." He eyed her as if assessing her strength. "How do I know I can trust you?" Weak was her best weapon. She let out a small, sad sigh. "You don't, but can you honestly trust any woman? Besides, you're the one with the gun and we're in a locked cabin. Where can I go?" He gave her a glance that made her think she was on the menu as he took out a key and uncuffed her hands and legs. She massaged where the metal chafed her. "Just a word of warning, wine makes me very friendly." Alexandra pointed her toward the bar with a sly grin. "Just what the boss ordered. Why don't you pour?" "I'd love to." Emily knew that his eyes were on her figure, which had been his plan. Her blue pants hugged her hips and she gave an extra shimmy as she poured 2 glasses of wine. She turned and handed him a glass with a flirty smile. Slinging the strap of her pocketbook over her shoulder, she picked up her wine and sashayed in front of him to keep him distracted as she sank to the edge of her chair, casually hanging her pocketbook behind her like they were in a restaurant and everything was completely normal. He offered his glass for a toast. After a clink, Emily gulped her drink. He watched her and shook his head. "So American. You gulped that down fast." "I guess I'm nervous. Do you have any crackers or cheese?" Alexandre got up and searched the cabinet beneath the bar. While he wasn't looking, she reached behind her and slipped her phone and prescription pills for stopping men at a nightclub in her lap, hiding them beneath a napkin. He returned. "Nothing to eat. Now where were we?" "You need to drink," she laughed, getting up and going to the bar to pour another. "I needed it. It's been a long day." She let out a sigh and turned to him with a wink, then faced the bar again. "I'll drink this one slower." Emily typed without looking at her phone at all and hoped for the best. "Dane, we're on the train to Paris." Now she wasn't 100% sure they were off to Paris, but Ted had said bank, so she put it together. She tucked her phone beneath the napkin. Alexandra asked, "So how did you get mixed up with treasure hunting with Dane Pearce?" "Right." She slowly took the cap off the prescription bottle, not wanting to make a sound. She returned to the table with a pill hidden in her palm and sat again. The table provided cover for her phone and the bottle as she leaned forward. "I hadn't planned to be. 2 days ago I graduated from college. Ted and his men showed up when I was out with my friends. So did Dane and his guys." "Congratulations." He lifted his glass to drink. She tapped her glass with his and sipped. "Thanks. I wish I could get home and not be here." Alexandra drank. "I understand. Sometimes I wish that I wasn't on VetSan's payroll." Emily scooted her chair closer to his, then ran her hand through her short bob like a model on a shoot. She tapped his hand as she looked him in the eyes. Once she was sure he was captivated, she slipped her pill in his wine. "Why are you?" He turned his hands so they were palm to palm and let out a small sigh. "Most of the time I'm not aiming my gun at beautiful women." For a hitman he wasn't horrible looking, but she needed him to wait to look at his drink, so she lowered her lashes and asked with a giggle, "You think I'm beautiful?" She glanced at the glass. Good. It was dissolved. Emily took her hand back and picked up her wine as he said, "You're the prettiest girl I've seen in the past year that I've had more than 5 minutes alone with, where I didn't have to just shoot her and leave her for dead." Her heart went cold as she thought about other women who he'd simply shot without one word spoken. Goosebumps grew on her arms. "Well, Alexandra, I don't want you to shoot me." He shrugged and sat back in his seat. "I don't want to shoot you either, but a job is a job." She held up her glass and gestured for another toast. "That's a horrible way to live. Have you thought about quitting?" "No." He tapped his glass with hers. Adrenaline rushed through her as she waited. He sipped his wine, as she did, and finished his first glass. Without being asked, she poured him more. Michael had always said this worked fast. Alexandra's pupils widened. As she handed him the second glass, he shook his head and said, "I'm feeling dizzy." A moment later, his forehead hit the table. She picked up her pocketbook, fluffed her hair, and patted him on the back. "Sorry, Alexandra, I didn't have a lot of time to mix a smaller dose." Her brother-in-law had always told her to be prepared. "Thank you, Michael. I'll be going now. Thanks for the wine." She reached behind him and took the keys. As she approached the door, she said a little prayer that it would open. She twisted the handle and heard it unlatch with a release of breath. She was free. Now she just needed to get off the train, undetected. But one step at a time. Chapter 6. Once on his plane headed for New York, Uriel didn't leave the bar. Brady and Henry filed flight manifests and spoke to ground control. But none of that mattered to him. Uriel's skin buzzed. Emily was gone. He'd killed her when he let her come along. His head pounded from grief, or the whiskey, or both. But the memory of Emily's blue eyes as she climbed out the limo window haunted him, probably forever. If he'd been 30 seconds faster, could he have saved her? The question didn't stop demanding an answer, and no amount of shots silenced it. In fact, the question seemed to grow louder with every glass. Time slowed down, slower than sand in an hourglass. A shot of whiskey didn't make time move faster. But he'd keep trying. His friends had dragged him away from the limo wreck, shoved him on his plane, where they now waited for takeoff. The authorities at least had Ted's face on camera. This had been Vet Sand's sloppiest job in years, which meant he was desperate. The man's wrinkles were almost as haunting as Uriel's guilt. He poured the last shot and finished the bottle. Brady picked up the empty glass bottle. Uriel turned toward him and slurred his words. "We didn't pack enough whiskey." Sitting beside him, Brady shook his head like he was disappointed. Uriel's skin itched like razors rubbed against him as Brady said, "You don't normally drink like this," because Emily had been alive. Though out of his world for years, she'd been safe, away from him. Now all he could remember was how she tasted sweeter than honey. His mind flashed to the day his mother had been murdered and how Emily had held him back, saving his life. He hadn't returned the favor. He squeezed his eyes shut and wished her blue eyes would fade from his memory. "I have to tell her family." Brady took the glass to the bar to the left of the cockpit. "I've been monitoring the local police wires for hours now. They found no trace of human remains." The explosion boomed in his ears with each blink of his eye. Somehow, if he'd been faster, he might have saved her. He shook it off and banged on his small table. "When I find Ted, I'm done playing games." He heard Henry in the cockpit talking to the tower. Then, what sounded like cleared. There was no more shots to take. They had to get home, but even home wouldn't be enough to forget her. Emily had already haunted him, but now she'd star as his biggest mistake. And this was all Ted's fault. Sure, the man had stolen a few things from various digs over the years and sold them to private buyers. But he'd never been sloppy. Or a murderer. Now he was both. Uriel's blood boiled as he shook his head. "What does Ted want?" Brady wiped Uriel's glass clean at the bar while he said, "He's foiled your finds a few times. He killed Emily." Uriel straightened as if a dagger had pierced his spine. Somehow, someway, he'd avenged this awful wrong. Emily deserved far more. Brady put the glass down and folded the bar towel. "Look, I didn't see blood, just smoke. Granted, my eyes burned, but I stalled our leaving so I could find more proof. There was no body, no DNA. Look, I'll go try to dig up more whiskey for you, but maybe you should have some hope that all isn't lost." Brady was the optimist. He was the realist. Emily was dead and his heart shriveled and died with her. For now, he needed to drink and forget. Tomorrow he'd channel his biological father's thirst for revenge and craft out every detail. He placed his head on the table and hoped the pounding stopped. He heard a ring. He'd have ignored, but Brady called out, "Uriel, your phone, it could be the authorities with news." He found it, reading the screen. "Dane, we're on the train to Paris." Uriel's eyes sharpened and he read the text again. Emily, she was alive. He jumped out of his chair, though he swayed from the whiskey as he said, "We need to head to Paris." Brady walked from the back toward the cockpit with a bottle in hand, though he put it on the bar rather than give it to Uriel. "I'll tell Henry. Care to explain what changed your mind?" Uriel handed Brady his phone and tried to shake off the bottle he'd just had. "Emily's alive." Brady smiled like he wanted to say he'd been right all along, but bounced forward and spoke to Henry. Uriel splashed water on his face from the bar sink. Brady returned and directed him to the bathroom. "Let's get you cleaned up then. You'll need a level head." "Right." Without a care, he dropped his clothes and hopped in the compact shower. The plane took off and Uriel held the handlebars while the water washed away the grime of the explosion. If Emily was alive, she'd need him. He'd not disappoint her or let her die again. Finally, he turned off the water and found a clean black t-shirt and his favorite brand of jeans he'd kept on board in the event of an emergency. Once dressed, he returned to the cabin and saw Brady reading his tablet. Uriel opened a bottle of water and gulped it. If they are heading to Paris, then Ted has her necklace. The impulse to text Emily back hit him, but he remembered his biological father's cautionary advice to never tell anyone your plans, especially who you intend to see or who you intend to rescue or surprise. Michael's voice even said the words. This time Uriel would listen to him. Emily certainly would. Breathing deep, he put his empty plastic bottle in the trash. Brady cleaned his glasses from fingerprints with a microfiber towel he carried in his back pocket. Is that important? Uriel tapped his fingers, needing something to do, something to focus on to help the whiskey wear off. Then he remembered the small black box. He hadn't opened it. He jumped out of his seat and ran to his jacket, where it was still in the pocket. He took it out and returned to this seat. It was smaller than a box people used for proposing marriage. He showed it to Brady like it was a ring. It's the key to the next piece of the puzzle. Brady fixed his glasses on his face but laughed like Uriel had just proposed. For the first time in hours, Uriel laughed too. What's in it? Brady leaned over his armrest to see. I don't know. Uriel transitioned it around until he saw a pinhole. He shook it and pressed on every angle. Nothing. He went to the bar to find a metal fork or a knife to pry it open. Brady asked, what kind of clue would be in this other than a ring to give Emily when we find her? I'm not giving Emily a ring. Uriel looked up briefly while he tried to push the small lock with the fork, but the tines were too thick. Besides, this is from the Pearce family vaults. She wouldn't want whatever it is. Clearly, Brady said sarcastically. She still wears the jewelry you gave her, out with her friends. True, she hadn't tossed the necklace somewhere and hooked up with some other guy. The thought left a knot in his throat, but he focused on the box. He needed something thinner. The earring had a smaller pin, so he went through his tool chest and found a small metal wire. Finally, he jimmied the hole. I don't know. A second later, he clicked the lock. There. It opened and he lifted a silver key the size of a diamond ring off a black velvet pillow. He kept it in his open palm. Brady asked impatiently, what is it? Uriel held it up to the light as he stated the obvious. It's the key. He read the inscription. This was clearly the security box key to the bank in Paris. He met Brady's gaze. Do you know what this means? Brady folded his hands between his knees. No, I'm a few steps behind you. He returned the key to the box and put it in his jean pocket as he explained to Brady. With Emily's necklace, Ted and his guys might get in the bank, but they won't get inside the security box without this. Brady gave him a pensive look like he was solving his own puzzle. How do you know that? It's the name of my father's bank and this key opens the box. Uriel realized fast Emily would demand to go with Ted, which meant he could find her. Nothing ever stopped her. Criminals should probably be thankful she hadn't become a cop as she was relentless. Lightness filled his chest. For a man who never talked about his past until a pretty girl showed up for one of our trips, I will say this. Brady stood and found a bottle of water for himself at the bar. You have an interesting backstory, Uriel. Brady and Henry, and their archaeological travels, had helped him forget his mother's death and Edmund Pearce's betrayal of what he thought was his family. He immediately recalled the feel of Emily's arms wrapped around him as they lay entwined after prom all those years ago. It might have been the last time he'd ever been so peaceful, which was one of the reasons he'd run. He sobered up as they flew toward Paris. The past doesn't matter, but we need to get Emily. We must be at the bank before Ted. Henry announced via speaker from the cockpit. 15 more minutes. Perfect. Soon he'd wrap his arms around Emily again and not let go. Her death had shaken his life clear of all doubts. Brady, still at the bar counter, made 3 coffees. Where do we go first? Uriel accepted a mug and answered, Emily will meet us at the bank. He knew that with every certainty. Brady walked to the cockpit with the second cup. Uriel sipped the caffeinated drink as he imagined all that Emily had learned, which must have been from Michael. And Michael had ice in his veins when he went after whatever he wanted. Michael's coldness had never bothered his new family of women he'd surrounded himself with, including Emily as his sister-in-law in charge. Michael had once said Dane should think of Emily as his sister, which was why he'd insisted he return to boarding school and avoided his biological father's home as much as possible. Emily was never his relation, and it was better if Michael kept his distance too. He'd already had one horrible father and didn't want to double his luck. So he changed his name and his life. Thanks to Michael, Emily wasn't completely helpless. Somehow she'd survived, and now they could finish this jewelry nonsense together. He'd return the jewels and continue to help in the world instead of just be another rich boy with a bad childhood. He'd been ready to go back without pursuing this anymore. Now the key almost radiated heat, though he knew he was just imagining it. Brady returned and asked, "How are you?" "I'm thinking clearly now," he finished his last gulp as Brady rejoined him. Uriel glanced at his friend, who offered his tablet. Dr. Brady Booker was excellent with math and code, and Uriel read his notes about the limo crash that didn't have any bodies. He'd also pulled up all the train schedules and possible banks in Paris. Brady had been solving Emily's disappearance while Uriel had been drowning his grief. Brady's logical genius brain had led him to full professor when he'd turned 25, and why Brady was one of the best partners he'd ever had. "Emily will show up at the bank, and not before then." Uriel handed the device back. Brady tucked his tablet away in his bag as he asked, "Are you certain?" Perhaps there was a better plan. His mind considered how best to handle this as he said, "Emily's always been good at doing exactly what she wants, when she wants. Nothing stops her, not even men with guns. I've known this about her since we met as teenagers." "Sounds formidable." Brady sipped of his coffee. "I didn't realize you were hiding such a girl away, and that's why you never flirted. You do enough flirting for both of us." Uriel took out his phone and ensured the text message wasn't displayed on the home screen, though seeing her name there made his heart soar. He didn't want Brady to think he was a besotted fool. "She's awe-inspiring and slightly terrifying. That's why you love her." Brady finished his coffee. Chest tight, Uriel cleaned his screen and offered his phone to his friend. "Love? That's a bit of a stretch. Can you track her through this?" "Yeah." Brady waited for Uriel to type in his passcode before taking the device. Not that Brady wasn't an ace at cracking passwords, but his politeness was nice. "It's not a hard hack." Uriel took the seat next to him and pointed to his contacts. "Here is her number." Brady studied his settings and then made a tsk sound like Uriel was the complete idiot in the group as he said, "She's on your tracker app already." "Tracker app?" Michael, no wonder his biological father never bothered him much. He knew where they all were, all the time. Uriel vaguely remembered how Michael had gone into his cloud and apps when he'd moved into their house for 2 years, and he'd kept his number. For years he transitioned phones and just let the stores do the upgrades. Brady clicked into the settings while Uriel said, "I forgot about that. Who are Michael, Sophie, Abigail, and Isabel?" Brady glanced up as the plane began its descent. "You have more people in your life than I suspected." Until he'd met Emily and her sisters and his biological father, he'd spent his life the spoiled only son of a murderer. Uriel's heart raced. "The closest people I have to a family." Brady gave him a concerned, ready to interfere look and didn't type at all as he asked, "Are you related to Emily?" Uriel's cheeks heated. "Through marriage, technically, and we only lived under the same roof for one summer." Brady shrugged and then flipped the screen to the settings again. "Ah well, as your phone only needs the Wi-Fi connection here." They waited for the app to update, and then Brady said, "She's currently zipping through Normandy. We'll beat her to Paris. Tell Henry her coordinates. Maybe there's a closer airport." Brady stood up and then stopped abruptly, still holding Uriel's phone. "1 second, I'm getting her train information. Are you sure we should wait to meet her at the bank?" "No, she's first. The bank is second. We might have to split up tomorrow." They had a chance to ensure Ted was caught and save Emily. He followed his friend to the cockpit and said, "If possible, I'll need you at the bank with this key, while I go get her." All three of them had a fast talk, cementing their plan. Henry spoke to ground control as Brady said, "We'll get her back for you, Uriel." Emily being safe would allow him to breathe again. He nodded. "We'll make sure that the authorities of Paris know that Ted, who just broke into a bank in London, is also on that train." "Very well," Henry said. "Now why don't you two take your seats?" Dane would do his best to save Emily, or at least help her as she freed herself. Then they'd solve the century-old mystery of the missing jewels together, or not at all. Chapter 7. Emily's blue flats pounded against the train's floor. The plush carpet was gone now that she'd raced away from the main cabins. If she stayed in sight, Ted had already proven he'd come after her. She made a tactical decision in her dash. Luggage was good. Luckily, in her flight from the cabin, she'd avoided Ted, and finally she threw open the luggage compartment with rows of stacked suitcases and closed the door behind her. Her heart raced, but she needed to not be recognized. Ted knew what she was wearing, and to blend into the crowd, later she'd need new clothes as a disguise, and hopefully a hat. She scanned the stacks and found 4 bags that looked like ones she'd use, and unzipped them. The first suitcase had no clothes at all but was filled with old photographs of World War II. Adrenaline rushed in her veins as the thought of being caught buzzed in her mind. She zipped the bag fast and opened another, rewarded with denim and cotton, but before she got too excited, she lifted a pink sweater meant for a child. Closing that suitcase, her heart pounded with the need to hurry. Emily hunkered down behind 2 larger pieces of luggage, snug but out of sight as she searched the cases. "Hurry, Emily." Her trembling fingers pulled the clasp on the 3rd bag, and her shoulders bowed with relief. A black t-shirt, a pair of shorts that fit her, and a Red Sox baseball cap to hide her blonde hair. She put her expensive outfit in its place at the bottom as she changed behind stacked luggage, then switched out her jewels, trading the real necklace and earrings for the fakes in her custom-made bra with special pockets. Men laughed outside the luggage compartment. She held her breath, but then the voices went away. Good. No one had come in. She had just put the bags back when her phone beeped and she read, "Emily, can you get to the last car of the train?" She smiled, glad her phone was on silent, and glanced around the luggage car. The room was still quiet as she texted back, "Why, are you here?" The dots on her screen made her feel wanted, though that was silly. Dane wasn't interested in romance and neither was she. They were there because Ted wanted to kill her for jewelry. Better not think about that. She held her breath and ignored how she wished Dane might walk into the luggage compartment, as if she needed saving. He finally typed back, "Henry and I are at the next station where you're about to make a sudden stop." The door to the luggage compartment opened. She ducked underneath some bags and hid out of sight. She didn't move a muscle and lowered her screen on her phone to a dim setting. Footsteps echoed on the floor in front of her as she quickly typed out, "How long do I have?" 60 seconds. She clutched her phone and heard the door to the compartment open again. The last car on the train was too far, but she could get off and blend while she ran. Michael always said that chaos worked as a distraction, so she might need to cause a scene in order to escape. Unless Dane had a plan already. No one had ever rescued her before now, except her brother-in-law. No footsteps echoed in the luggage compartment as she typed fast, "I can't, but I'll get off. Just wait for me. You're why we're here." She moved the luggage and wiggled out of her cubbyhole. No one was around. The train crawled to a stop as she typed, "Now that reads sweet. Hurry." If only their relationship was normal. She remembered when Sophie had tried to tell her to think of Dane like a brother. That hadn't worked. Luckily, he'd left their house 2 months after he'd temporarily moved in, preferring boarding school to her family. After his assumed father shot his mother and tried to have Dane murder his actual father, Dane had nowhere else to go. So for the summer he'd moved into their new home, where her sister Sophie acted like a second mother to her younger sisters. After he left, he'd only ever come back on holidays when he had no excuse or vacation planned. But in her senior year she worked up the courage to ask him to take her to prom, as she wanted no one else at her side. The memories of how he'd given her his mother's necklace, and for that night made her feel like the most wanted woman on the planet. She'd never been happier. All of that had been a foolish girl's dream. Dane was still off limits, even if now he was coming for her. Her sister wouldn't understand her and Dane. No one ever did, including her. She wasn't supposed to want him. The doors opened at the station, and Emily dashed into a crowd of folks that intended to get off and find out why the train had stopped. She kept her head down, blonde hair tucked under her hat. No one would recognize her. As she stepped onto the platform, goosebumps grew everywhere but started on her neck, as she heard from behind her, "There you are, Miss Mira." Cold washed through her as she turned but backed up with the crowd. "Ted, Alexandra is probably still out like a light." Ted's wrinkled face became more pronounced with every step he took. His long strides made her heart sink. "I underestimated you. You're clearly formidable. Compliments don't work." She forced her shoulders to straighten. "Bullies don't need to see you're frightened." Michael's words resonated and she prayed he was right as adrenaline rushed through her. She turned to run, but Ted grabbed her wrist. She shook him off and said, "Ted, you won't win against Uriel." Ted gripped hard. "Are you sure about that, Emily?" Sweat went down her neck, but she sensed Dane was close. She couldn't see him, but her heart had a familiar ping of awareness. Ted said, "I've been researching you and Dane Pearce and your entire family." She tugged her hand free, her skin burning. he said. "The men who sent me for these jewels won't take your family's interference well." Her mind flashed to Michael and how he'd practiced defensive maneuvers before his breakfast. When she'd first met him, he'd sought revenge for his false imprisonment, not caring what happened to himself. "You haven't met my family then." She turned on her feet and ran right into Dane's embrace. He wrapped his arms around her. Dane, let's go." She didn't want to look back at Ted, who might start shooting. She peeked at the figure on the other side and saw his ally Henry. Dane hugged her so close she could hear his heartbeat before he released her. "This way." For some reason Ted didn't follow. Crowds of people hadn't stopped him before. Why now? They kept their pace fast as she held his side. "I'm happy to see you again." With Henry flanking her other side, Dane led her down the station and his arms sent a tremor that might be hope through her. He asked, "What were you trying to tell me in the limo?" She almost tripped over her own shoe, but he held her firm and neither one of them stopped. She blinked and just asked, "What?" "When I wanted you to jump, what did you say?" He held the door for the terminal for her, looking behind them to see if they were being followed. Inside there were people going in all directions, perfect for them to blend in. "I was getting my courage up to jump." She stared at his profile with his strong jawline and dark hair that would be wavy if he let it. "Which means? What did you say?" Her entire body froze. She hadn't been ready to jump. She squeezed his side and said, "Don't miss me." His lips thinned. He opened the door and she stepped outside beneath a bright blue sky with white fluffy clouds. She inhaled deeply of clean air to rid herself of the dank tracks around the station. Dane followed her, and then let the door close before he took her hand. "No, you said something you." Emily blinked. What had she said? Her mind was a blank and then she snapped her fingers. "Oh, I trust you." She knew he'd catch the box when she tossed it, and he would have caught her if she'd jumped. But then Ted had kidnapped her from the other side of the limo before blowing it to smithereens. "Ah!" His face darkened. They headed toward a car, but she patted his stomach and tried to get his attention. The moment he turned toward her, she sucked in her bottom lip, unsure what he was thinking. "What did you think I said, Dane?" He guided her down a cement step. "Never mind." They walked onto a main street that was cleaner and more well-kept than any other city she'd ever been in. She chuckled. "Seriously, does no one in your world challenge you?" Henry watched the crowd and took out his phone like he'd use it as a weapon. "Not like you." Dane pressed his hand on her back, getting her attention toward a car at the intersection. She turned toward him and looked into his eyes. Memories of his lips on hers raced through her. Her pulse grew faster as she stood on her tiptoes to be taller as she said, "I see that." Her eyelids fluttered closed and his arms held her tight. A moment later he kissed her and the world faded. So much so that everything went dark. A second later, or so it seemed, her eyes fluttered open. She had a pounding headache on the back of her skull. The air smelled like dust and putrid water and made her nose twitch. This wasn't the street, it was too dark, and as her gaze focused in on black walls, until her flesh crawled and cigarette breath wafted into her nose, she turned to face up and realized she was lying on the ground with Ted leaning over her, tugging at her necklace. Her skin burned from his not-so-gentle grab and instinct took over. She still had her pocketbook with her. She jolted upwards and sat fast though he pressed against her neck. Emily reached for his wrist. Ted almost broke the clasp of her necklace, but she knocked him off of her and he bolted. Her reactions were dulled from the splitting pain in her head. Dane sat beside her and jumped to his feet, offering his hand to her as she asked, "Where are we?" "I don't know." She brushed dirt off her exposed legs. Ted was on the other end of the area, near the beam of light above his head, which illuminated the gun he had pointed at them. She whispered, but her voice echoed as she said, "Where's Henry?" "Good question." Dane stepped forward to protect her. In this small dark space, a chamber of some kind, and Ted having a gun, the move was sweet but wouldn't save her. If Ted fired once, he might get them both, and they'd be dead. Ted motioned with the gun toward Dane as he asked, "Did you think I was going to let you and Emily Mira go so easily, Uriel? Or should I call you Dane Pearce?" Dane stood in front of her. "Let her go. Until this latest adventure of ours, I never threatened you before, Dane." Ted's aim was steady. "Tell you what, I'll let you both go if I get the necklace and earrings." Emily instantly reached for her necklace and said, "Done." "Don't," Dane answered back. She held her breath as her bluff might not work, but she tossed the chain of gold blossoms at Ted, wishing she could share the truth with Dane as she reached for her earrings. "Look, this jewelry isn't worth your life, or mine." She lobbed one earring and unfastened the last. Ted pocketed the jewels. "Finally, Miss Mira, you make sense." Dane shook his head. "Emily, don't." "Here." She tossed the last earring. The real jewels were in her bra, and the fake Ted head was a perfect replica. Would it get him inside the bank? She hoped to bargain for their lives now for a chance to stop him later. Ted flashed a light in the darkness toward a ladder as he held the gun at them. "Both of you, good luck. Where are we?" she asked. Dane raced toward the ladder as soon as the gun was off him. Ted had a head start up the steps and outside, then he slammed the metal hatch down over them, leaving them in the dark. She took out her phone and shined her flashlight as Dane climbed the ladder and banged against the sealed metal door. More metal scraped, as if something was being dragged over it. Her heart pounded in tune with Dane's fists on that metal door. Her mind raced, but she circled with the bright light. They were underground, her nose smelled stale water, so this might be near a sewer. Dane stopped banging, but goosebumps grew on her arms as he said, "Ah!" She turned her phone flashlight toward another wall and jumped as she screamed, "Skulls!" He leapt down and suddenly Dane's warmth around her waist helped her normalize her breathing. These skulls were old. "Emily, why did you give him that necklace?" The necklace didn't matter. She swallowed and shined her phone in more directions to get a lay of the room. In the outskirts of Paris, depending on the composition, this was either World War II remnants or the French Revolution. Clothes on bodies would be a tell, but if they were only skulls, this was probably a tomb from the Revolution. "He was going to kill you. I think these people have been here for hundreds of years." She studied a shred of fabric and found her answer. The royal blue was well liked at the court of Louis XVI. She met Dane's gaze again and said, "It was probably the French Revolution. Doesn't matter about the skulls. The jewelry you gave Ted gives him power." He knelt down like he was making a similar assessment, taking out his own cell phone to study the remains. Without talking in a decade, they somehow had more in common than they'd discussed. One day having a conversation over coffee with no pressure to discuss likes and dislikes might be fun and normal. She couldn't let him go again. To get his attention, she coughed on dust he stirred up as he moved one of the skulls. She covered her mouth until the dust settled. "How are we getting out of here?" He stood and wiped his hands on his pants. "You're avoiding my question." She showed him her phone. "Look, cell service doesn't work down here." He checked his as well and turned his flashlight off. "Answer the question, Em. Focus on getting out of here." She crossed her arms, but he didn't move. Throwing her hands to her side in exasperation, she then reached into her bra. "I gave him a fake." "What?" He scooted closer. She unzipped the pockets that were specially designed for her when she wore expensive things and showed him her necklace. "I still have the real necklace you gave me." "Seriously?" He cupped it in his palm, laughing with triumph. She took it from him. "I'm fearless, remember?" Emily dropped her phone and the room became completely dark. The dust itched her nose. She put the necklace back in her bra. "So, how are we getting out of here?" "We're going to have to wait it out." Dane used his flashlight to help her see, and her body heated. He probably saw the outline of her breasts. He bent down and picked up her phone, handing it to her. Awareness wasn't good here. They needed to escape, not have sex like animals. At least not here, not now. He walked her toward the ladder, but she shook her head. "That's your answer? People died down here." "Yep." He pulled her toward the ladder where her bare legs brushed against the metal. With his arms on either side of her, she began to tremble and ache for his kiss as she asked, "What's going on?" "Nothing. It seems we have similar interests we've never discussed." His warm breath mixed with hers and her eyelids fluttered. "Yes, that's true. Attraction wasn't good, and that's all this was." She rested her hands on his chest and shook her head. Something didn't click. They should be looking for an exit. "But you're way too cocky right now." "I'm not." He leaned closer. If he came closer, she'd wrap her arms around his neck and run her fingers through his hair, kissing him again. She shook off the image. "Uh-huh. Tell me what you're thinking, Dane." His lips were a fraction from hers now, and he closed his eyes. He was so close her body came alive, waiting for his touch. "You're going to have to kiss me for that one." His lips brushed against hers. It took everything she had not to just let this happen. She pushed him back. "Here?" He gave her a smirk as he asked, "Why not?" Her mind twirled. He wasn't upset. Something was going on with Dane, and he hadn't told her why he was so calm. She pressed her lips together and met his hypnotizing brown eyes that shined like beacons of salvation. "Because there are insects, and if you remember, I prefer soft and pretty." "I thought you died today." His hands brushed against her sides. A hum grew in her veins. Her head no longer throbbed from being hit. Her lips parted slightly. "So you missed me?" "Yes." "That's all you had to say?" She met his kiss and Nicoin. This time she held him and didn't let him go. Her body heated despite where they were. Light shining down through the cracks around the metal hatch reminded her that they were in danger. She dragged her body off his and let the damp air and stale smell cool her ardor. She heard someone at the hatch. The light that filtered down shone like a rainbow around the underground chamber. How are we getting out? Hold on. He brought his phone from his back pocket. Her gaze narrowed. Phones don't work down here. He showed her a small attachment. Henry has a tracker. It doesn't need Wi-Fi even if we're stuck in a tomb the local villages must have built during the revolution. That was my guess about this place too, but either way I seriously like your Henry. The hatch above them creaked opened. Brady designed it. Dane hugged her and whispered in her ear, "But you like me more. You're the only one here I've kissed." She patted him on the cheek. "But it's nice to see you have friends who are off limits to you. We will keep our kisses between us once we get out." Henry gestured for them to climb up. His friends were cute but not for her. Brady might be a good match for her sister Isabella, not that she'd mention that. Dane's jealousy was adorable. She turned and settled her foot on a metal rung and had the sense Dane stared at her legs in her borrowed black shorts on the climb up. She took Henry's hand at the top and breathed in fresh air. Dane came out a moment later. Henry said, "You're all right." The two men whispered about something but she was overwhelmed by the dust and grime on her clothes and coughed. They both looked at her and she said, "I need a shower and clean clothes." Dane nodded, which shook some cobwebs out of his dark hair. "Let's go." He turned to Henry and brushed the dust off his jeans, then looked down the street. She followed his gaze and saw Brady in the distance as lookout, near a car. Dane asked Henry, "How did we get in the tomb?" Henry explained as they walked toward Brady. "Ted was after Emily and you. We tried to fight them but 4 men grabbed you two and ran faster than us." Henry showed him the phone. Brady's inventions work. Dane wrapped his arm around her waist and they walked together down the street, Henry on the other side of Dane. The three of them headed toward the sunshine and brightly lit street. This wasn't over, but they'd survived and she had the jewels. It was a start, and maybe she'd kiss Dane a few more times before this all ended. She couldn't deny whatever this was between her and Dane anymore. She'd always felt it, but tried to stay away because they could never be forever. Chapter 8. Uriel didn't mind being Dane when Emily held his hand while underground. She didn't panic or scream at the sight of skulls. Not that he expected her to, but he'd never realized how similar they were. She was prepared, with those fake jewels, but that went back to Michael. He taught Emily to survive and he owed his biological father for that. Emily made the world brighter. Not that he'd say so, but having her here with him made everything better. He let the thoughts that she shouldn't be here at all return as he handed over his credit cards for 3 separate hotel rooms. Brady was at a hotel near the bank, as previously planned. He signed the credit card statement and waited for the keys. The front desk clerk wrote down the 3 rooms and handed them electronic keys with a folded paper including a map of the hotel. He immediately handed it over to Emily. In her dusty black t-shirt that matched his own, her room was in the middle of the other 2. Emily accepted the key and smiled at him despite the soot on her cheek. She clutched her blue pocketbook. Once they were out of earshot of the front desk heading toward the elevator, he slipped an arm around her waist. "Tomorrow we go to Paris in the bank." She turned and stared at his profile while they walked. He pressed the UP button as she asked, "Isn't that giving Ted time to steal your box?" "I hope so." The 3 of them stepped into the elevator together. No one said anything until the doors closed. Emily shook out dust from her short blonde hair. She'd lost her baseball hat in the tomb and said, "It also gives him time to set a trap for us." Henry nodded like he agreed with her, that Ted might set a trap, but their plan was hopefully bulletproof. They'd use their collective brains, sending Brady toward Paris first. If their idea worked, they'd turn the tables on Ted. They just needed to follow the plan. Emily stretched like she was exhausted. Uriel kept his lips sealed. As the elevator's doors opened, they shuffled down the white halls toward their room numbers. He quickly talked to Henry, who had the room closest to the elevator, about checking in with Brady. Henry agreed and went into his room with a wave at Emily. Uriel and Emily paused before her door. He wanted to make her proud, to earn her regard, and hopefully she wouldn't always think he was a sucker who'd almost killed his real father because his fake father had tried to frame a murder on him. If Emily hadn't stopped him, perhaps he'd have been successful in that tragedy. But he didn't want that to define him in her eyes. The truth was that she was perfect and he didn't want to let her go, not again. He held her lower back. "You need a shower and clean clothes." That takes a half an hour max. She stalled near her door. He glanced around the hall, needing to ensure they were alone as his friends didn't need to see his weakness. She turned from him and opened her door, waving for him to follow her inside. His heart beat a little faster as she switched the light on, but he stayed near the door and spoke in a low voice. Brady is at a hotel near the bank and he's going to report to Henry everything he sees. The Paris authorities are alerted to Ted, with his photo, and the bank is now aware he has fake identities. You did great, you know. Thank Michael for training me so well. She took off her sneakers that were not her usual name brand style, and her face had a smudge of dirt on it that she'd freak out about. Right. He reached for the door handle to leave and said, "Grab a shower, then we'll have a nice dinner, just the two of us." Like a date? Her face lit up like Christmas morning. He held still though adrenaline raced through him. Is that a problem? She ran her hand down his shirt. No, but we'll order you a nice suit. Now that sounded like Emily. The twinkle in her blue eyes was the same twinkle she'd had the day she'd pulled him into her arms and kissed him, to save him from himself. Why a suit? She crossed her arms in challenge. Because I want to be wined and dined in style. Impressing her would be hard. How could he top the necklace from his mother? Neither one of them were wide-eyed innocents anymore. He didn't move. We need to be safe. She shrugged and pointed for him to leave as she said, "This is a 5-star hotel. I'm sure you'll find a way to impress me. I'll send clothes to your room while you make plans." He stepped into the hall and nodded his goodbye. You're still bossy as ever. She held the door frame and stared at him like he was a ghost. He froze as she asked, "Is that why you left years ago?" Right. He'd hightailed it after prom night. In their hotel bed he'd been alive and forgotten who he was, tainted by murder and lies. It had been wonderful and terrifying. Now his fingers grazed hers on the frame. I left because seeing your sister and Michael so happy all the time was a knife to my heart. My entire childhood was an orchestrated lie and I'd been used as a pawn. I needed to be my own man, Em. She intertwined her fingers with his and squeezed his palm. How were you a pawn? My mother's death. He pressed his forehead to hers. Emily already knew how he'd been used because she'd seen it with her own eyes. Nobody understood what had happened better than her. In taking off, he'd tried to forget his past, but denying his memories hadn't given him any peace either. The only true peace he'd had was her, safe and in his arms. She batted her eyes at him, and her smile was brighter than the lights on the Eiffel Tower. So your leaving wasn't anything to do with me. Seriously. He'd left because he couldn't let himself stay. Her arms were like heaven, and at the time he hadn't thought he deserved that. He gently wiped a smudge of dirt from the crypt from her cheekbone. You were why I stayed as long as I did. You were always an umbrella in the thunderstorm of my life. I stayed until I couldn't stay anymore. Umbrella? She laughed and brushed some of the dust off his black shirt. Not that it would ever get clean and straightened. Okay. Come get me in an hour. She shooed him out and shut her door. A shower would be the first thing he'd do to impress her. He let himself in the room to her left and stripped as soon as the door closed behind him. His clothes had an odor and it was probably a good idea to burn them. He dropped them on the floor and headed into the shower. A knock sounded and he tensed, turning the water off. Room service? He relaxed as he remembered Emily's promise. He peeked through the peephole and saw a man in a hotel uniform with a plastic bag. Dane let him in. The suit. Yes, sir. The Lacoste brand was one of his favorites, and Emily likely knew his size though he hadn't told her. He tipped. Thanks. He'd almost closed the door but then stopped. Hey, what's the best place to impress a woman at this hotel? We have a rooftop restaurant. The man smoothly pocketed the tip. Thanks. He closed the door and opened his bags. How thoughtful. Emily had sent more than just a suit, and he now had clothes for tomorrow. After his shower, he filled out the slip for the hotel to do his dry cleaning and changed into new dark jeans and a black t-shirt. A rooftop restaurant sounded romantic. He left the note for maid service and headed to the top of the hotel. The staff was setting up for dinner, and Dane found the manager of the restaurant. I'll buy every table out for tonight. It's usually very busy, the manager protested. That's fine. Dane handed over his black card. I want to be alone with my colleague. Very well, sir. The man rang up a 6-figure number. Normally Dane spent his paycheck on burgers and never touched the cash that kept accumulating from his supposed father, except when he wanted to solve a mystery that might right all the wrongs the Pearce name had done. The money he spent on this restaurant didn't put a dent in his riches. The manager handed him back the card as Dane said, "It will just be 2 of us. Could you possibly find a violin?" Yes, sir. The manager put the receipt in the register. I will personally take care of it. Dane smiled his thanks and hurried back toward his room when his phone rang. Ah, Brady, he answered quickly and hoped that nothing had gone wrong. How are things in Paris? Quiet, Brady assured him. I'm running online searches of the dark web to see if I can figure out who Ted's buyer for the jewels might be. Right, if anyone was good at hacking, it was Brady. In Cairo, Brady's scans had uncovered the hidden tombs in the Valley of Kings. He'd worked on his computer program for days, drinking only coffee in his hotel room. Brady often said he hung out with Uriel, because adventure followed him. That was probably true, but tonight he was just Dane, who wanted to charm his girl. I appreciate it. Make sure to enjoy the hotel room. Get room service at least, he heard typing. This might be interesting. So many times the thread disappears. I'll tell you what I find tomorrow morning, Brady said. Dane glanced at Emily's door. Soon they'd be together. He licked his lips and remembered her sweet kisses as he told his friend, "Good luck." He returned to his room and saw the floor lacked his dirty clothes. He would leave a big tip when they checked out. Dane changed into his tailored gray suit and adjusted his thin blue tie. The hour almost over. He combed his clean hair in the bathroom, and then slipped into the new shoes Emily had also bought for him for tonight. Dressed to her specifications, Dane knocked on her door. Emily answered, still in her bathrobe, though her blonde bob was shiny and smelled like jasmine. Her eyes lifted to his as she smiled. "Dane, there you are." Her skin glowed and she gestured for him to come inside. His heart beat faster, as if he should have brought flowers like he had on prom night. "You look like you spent all day in a spa." She checked her face in the hall mirror. "Is that a compliment?" "Yes. I like your haircut. It suits you." He remembered what Emily looked like naked underneath that robe and wondered if anything had changed. She headed into the bathroom but kept the door open as she picked up a dress still encased in plastic wrap. "I wish I'd thought to write down the name of the person I took the clothes from on the train so I could send them back, cleaned and pressed. They'd understand. If she was him, he'd want to leave cash too." He saw her leg flash at the door and goosebumps grew on his body. "Are you ready?" Almost. Yet her slender hand reached for lotion. Either she was getting into that dress or she was about to walk out completely naked. His body hardened and he fixed his tie. "What are you doing?" "I need to look perfect tonight," she said in a sultry tone. "I'm almost done." He let go of his tie and took a deep breath. It was better not to get his hopes up. "Why? You're just with me. I don't want you to leave me in the morning." He heard the plastic of her bag rip. He relaxed at her answer. They were heading out, but they'd be coming back. He poured water into a glass from the sink outside the bathroom. "That's not going to happen." "Good to hear. I'm ready now." Emily stepped out of the bathroom in a sparkly peach knee-length dress that made her skin glow and hugged her body perfectly. It was like this dress had been made for her and only her. He instantly wanted to touch her. Dane realized his blue tie had the peach color of her dress embedded in it. Her eye for detail amazed him. "You're beautiful, Emily." "Thanks." She brushed her hand against her bare neck. "I didn't want to wear the necklace. Honestly, my bra needs washing. Yet I don't want it out of my possession, so I'm doing my best with a regular bra. The jewels are scraping my skin. Does it look odd?" She turned to the side and gestured to her cleavage. "The necklace." At any point Ted might realize she'd faked him out. Dane had checked into the hotel with an alias and taken security precautions, though he was well aware they might be tracked down. His shoulders tightened and he took her hand. He would step in front of a bullet for her. He eyed the smooth round of her chest. "I can't tell from my view." Changing the subject, he said, "You're the only person in the world who never held my mother's murder against me." Her blue eyes deepened with concern. "That's not true." "I don't want to talk about Michael," he interrupted. Michael was his biological father, but Dane didn't know him. Michael had saved his life that day, but thinking of him as a father, that was something else. His heart ripped as the memories replayed in his mind. He squeezed her hand a little tighter as Emily said, "He didn't blame you though. This was not important right now." He directed them toward her door. She picked up her pocketbook as he said, "I like kissing you." Her cheeks turned bright red and she stroked his chin near the door. "I like that too, but after dinner." "I'm hungry, Dane." "Nobody else calls me that." He escorted her out to the hall. She kissed his cheek. "You should have come to see me years ago, Dane. I've missed you." His skin burned from her touch. Emily Mira was a dangerous woman and nothing would keep him away from her internal fire. "I've missed you too. I hope you enjoy what I've got planned." It was short notice. "I'm sure I will." She folded her hands in front of her like they were about to parade around as the royal couple or something. He checked her door was locked and guided her toward the elevator. Hopefully she would be impressed with a rooftop dinner just for her. They were keeping a low profile, but at least he could show her a good time, in style. She deserved far more than roses before a dance. He'd known that then when he'd given her the jewelry. She glowed like an angel. His angel. Chapter 9. Emily's heart skipped just being near Dane, a man at ease in designer clothes or jeans. He'd pressed the rooftop button on the elevator, and she'd read in the hotel brochure that the restaurant there had a 5-star rating. Awareness of his fingers so close to hers yet not touching was heightened by the near brush of their bodies as they stood next to one another. Light jazz music played. His strong profile made her want to be with him always. She knew better than to think forever with Dane. Dane wasn't a forever guy. He was the one who had left her. In response, she dived into learning and lost herself in history, which always seemed more interesting than the real world with him gone. He'd said it wasn't her fault. Was she holding on to the past like a shield? Emily stepped onto the rooftop, dazzled by string lights and sheer white curtains that created a romantic floating tent. A string quartet played in the corner. Above was the bright moon and below, the white boulevards. Emily turned toward Dane with amazement. Dane stood proud in the suit she'd chosen, like his strong shoulders were holding up the world. She reached for his fingers. "This is beautiful, Dane." He kissed the back of her hand. "I didn't want to risk taking you out of the hotel tonight. We don't need more trouble." Agreed. Her heart fluttered. Boy, she was falling hard for Dane. Again. This magical rooftop was much nicer than prom had been. She let out a sigh as the matron bowed and greeted them. "It's been a long time since we've been able to just talk." Those stolen moments at Michael's house where they'd snuck down to the beach. She, spellbound by Dane and without a clue as to what the future might bring. He, torn by guilt. Now she knew herself, and him, and she'd hate herself if she didn't try. "This view is great." Dane directed them to follow the matron to a table. A waiter asked her opinion on the wine and she chose a Merlot. The waiter poured as she settled into her seat with a napkin on her lap. Once they were alone again, Dane asked her, "And the string quartet, too much?" "Not at all." She leaned closer and inhaled the woodsy scent of Dane's cologne. Being with him made her lips tingle. Heat rose to her face and she looked into her wine glass. "I've always had this crush on you and no other guy ever compared." He put his elbow on the small table. "Emily, no other woman could ever take your place. You shine brighter than any star." Emily glanced up at him and smiled. "Even your movie star?" His big, sexy brown eyes narrowed. "My what?" She reached for her earrings that weren't on her ear as she said, "We were at the Oscars, and my sister Isabel said she saw you. I ran into the room to find you but never did see you or your date." Now that she'd admitted her feelings, she sipped her wine with relief. Honesty was important, he had to know. Dane picked up his glass too. "Isabel was right. I was there but with a fellow Harvard teacher, Natalie. Her research that evening was the basis for a documentary. We went as friends, that's all. She isn't half as lovely as you. Isabel would be happy." Her sister had no idea what had happened between Emily and Dane, but she'd always asked if anyone had heard from him. For now though, Emily would keep him to herself as she memorized his strong shoulders and joked, "You must say that to all the girls." He pressed his hand to his heart. "I never flirt. I don't even try to talk to women, which always upsets Brady." Interesting. Dane was the type who didn't have to flirt. Her friends would have targeted him within minutes. He was attractive, smart, and aloof. Emily held her tongue while the waiter served their salads. When the waiter left, she asked, "Why does it bother Brady?" He picked up his fork and his cheeks went a little red. "He claims he tries to get women's attentions, but I always end up with..." He lowered his head. "Never mind. Let's enjoy the meal and each other." He took a bite of his salad. She let out another sigh as she said, "No, don't stop, Dane. We haven't talked in years." "So, you scored more women with the no-talking bit than Brady did with charming conversation?" He put his fork down as he laughed. "Yeah, I shouldn't have brought it up." She winked at his bashfulness. "As long as you don't turn into the silent type with me, we're fine." They finished their salads and the waiter cleared their plates. She sipped her wine and once they were alone, Dane asked her, "Why history, Emily? The girl I knew talked about a major in business and ruling the world." The waiter brought them lemon butter chicken and she was sure she'd gain 10 pounds. She picked up her fork as her mouth watered. She answered Dane with reluctance. She'd never told this to anyone, not even her friends in college. "The girl you knew grew up moving from apartment to house as my mom married many times. As you know, Sophie took me in when our mom died, but I never really had stability or much cash. In the years since, I've grown accustomed to having my own bank account. So history." He cut a piece of chicken. She put off answering to eat her dinner. Dane waited patiently, yet she knew he hadn't forgotten. After a few more bites, she glanced at him. Something about Dane made her want him to understand. I didn't have to struggle while I studied and had the luxury of following my interests. I like history because the stories all progress and teach what can happen if we continue to make the same mistakes. Some things are great puzzles that intrigue me. Why did you choose archaeology? He finished his chicken and rested his fork on the edge of the plate. Edmund hated when I got dirt on any part of my shirt. Dirt. Emily sat back and picked up her glass, though somehow, here she had no buzz of any kind from the alcohol. The red wine was perfect. He scooted closer and shifted his water cup on the table. In archaeology, I dig in the dirt all the time. Her eyes widened and she giggled. So this was rebellion? Maybe a little. I don't like thinking about Edmund. He shrugged. I do my best to live right. I'm not seeking fortune or fame, which means I can preserve bits of history for the public to see and learn from, rather than sell to some private collector. They tend to hide their treasures from the world. The waiter returned with a cream puff for dessert. She waited until he left, and then she whispered, "How long have you known Ted?" "He sells to private collectors and probably would have sold to Edmund if he'd lived to me." Dane straightened and handed her a fork so they could share the dessert. "A few times now he's stolen what I've found. The first time I was careless as I didn't know he existed at all." She bit into the frothy cream and powdered biscuit and didn't want to stop. They both ate the delicious dessert, their forks scraping the last bite. "And the second time? It was a race, and he was faster than me in finding the Incan gold relic." He leaned closer to her. "The next time I won. We've gone back and forth." Her heartbeat sped up. She wanted him to kiss her and only trusted herself enough to say, "I see." His face darkened. "Until you, I've never seen Ted use a gun." Walking into the club to see him pointing a weapon at you and your friends was surreal. She hoped they were okay. "Yeah, I understand. Surreal and terrifying, but he'd saved her." She pressed her hand on his chest. He edged closer and her eyes fluttered closed as he said, "Fate brought us together again, and for that I'm happy." He needed to kiss her. Why was he so far away? She didn't open her eyes as she whispered, "Maybe you and I should try for real, Dane." He brought his chair so close that his knees bumped against hers. "I like having you near, though I'd like for everything else around us to slow down. Kiss me already. We have more in common than I thought we did. Other than interest in old things." He chuckled and his mouth covered hers, gently at first, and then more passionately, letting her imagine a different world where everything was beautiful just from his kiss. The magic didn't stop as she wrapped her arms around his shoulders and twined his thick hair at his nape between her fingers. Never stopping was her vote. Unfortunately, he ended the kiss and his withdrawal made her ache. She tried to ignore the longing as she said, "Yeah. It's honorable that you'll give the jewels back. You don't have to. I want to do the right things in my life." He stood and offered his hand. The quartet played a classic tune and she clasped his palm, acknowledging the spark racing through her body. He said, "Besides, the jewels came from my stepfather's estate. He was just another private collector keeping treasures from the public. The man killed any love I might have had for him that day in the barn. Giving the necklace my mother loved to you brought me peace." He pulled her closer and swayed with her. She rested her head against the hollow at his throat and hugged him. "We don't have to talk about that anymore." Dane took her hands and spun her in a dance. They seamlessly found each other's bodies in harmony with the music. He said, "I never talk about any of that with anyone ever, Em. Don't you know how special you are to me?" He was the only guy she'd ever given a bit of her heart to. No other boyfriend had been that close. She made a decision to live in the moment as she adjusted his collar. "Dane, that's the sweetest thing you've said since we met. I only speak the truth." He pressed closer. She stood on her tiptoes and let the enchantment of the evening wash through her as she whispered into his ear, "Let's go to my room." He missed a step, then brought her closer, keeping her next to his heart. Tonight was theirs and she'd hold on to him for as long as he'd let her. Chapter 10. Waking up in Dane's arms made her body hum. Last night, Dane had proved all the ways he'd become a man. No one had rocked her like this ever. She curled into him. He groaned a little and kept his eyes closed as the sun must have started rising outside their heavy curtains that blocked the light. A few more minutes alone with Dane was good. He sighed. "I've missed you, Em. Seriously." Her heart skipped a beat. If only, no. She couldn't think about tomorrow right now. Instead, she hugged him and let his body heat warm her in the chill of the room. He ran his hand down her naked back and cupped her backside. Yeah, you, alone, like this. Emily smiled and vowed she'd stay in his arms for as long as she could. I bet you say that to all your naked women. He opened his eyes, glanced down at her willing body, and then laughed. Not at all. That's usually, it was nice to meet you, goodbye. Dane was the type to leave, but it didn't stop her attraction for him, at all. Emily curled her leg around his and tapped his muscular chest. You're bad. He rolled her beneath him and kissed her forehead. No one else compares. Every cell in her body came alive. Dane made her believe in happily ever after when she was in his arms. She sighed and said, let's say I believe that for a moment. You should. He stilled, propped himself up on his pillow with one hand, and stared down at her. You can ask Brady, who was briefly a roommate when we were getting our PhDs. She'd never shared much about herself with her other ex-boyfriends. But Dane knew her, and accepted that she hadn't turned into some savvy businesswoman, like her younger sister while still in college. He seemed to like that they had history in common. The large gates around her heart were unlocking for him. She glanced at his muscular body and said, even if I do believe you, I just wanted to say, I'd like to see you again after all this is over. He brushed her hair behind her head on her pillow. Maybe my university is hiring. A laugh escaped her lips, though she had those sparks inside her just from the gleam in his eyes. She shook her head and said, I'm pretty sure Harvard hires Ivy League. He stilled. Why didn't you go for an Ivy League college? We both know half of getting in is your bank account, and who you know. He spoke with the belief she was smart enough to get in and the rest was money or politics. She squeezed his hand and shrugged. I liked going home to see my family. Gainesville was far, but not so far in case of an emergency. I haven't been to see Michael in years. He didn't move a muscle. Right, her sister's husband, his father. Everyone in her family knew Dane. She swallowed and said, I know. He traced her arm and shoulder. Maybe after we return the jewels you'll go with me? Home, with Dane? Every cell in her body sparked with the idea they might have a future. I'd like that. He caressed her body, lowering the sheet. Me too. What do you plan to do with your life, now that you've finished getting your PhD? You didn't send me an invitation to your graduation. You wouldn't have come, and I didn't have your address. Do you have some professor gig waiting for you in Florida? No, the local universities weren't hiring. I was going to sell real estate. That sounds horrible. Just until I find a college that wants someone with my degree. Maybe you should move to Boston. There are lots of universities near me. She grabbed the sheet and held it closer, but otherwise didn't budge. Was he serious? She'd never lived with a man before. Her heart beat faster as she laughed again to pretend she wasn't nervous as she joked. Are you going to let me crash on your couch? His gaze narrowed. Couch? No. Oh. A hum grew in her veins. He was asking her to move in. This was new, and she wore a stupid smile on her face like she'd been dealt a good hand at cards. She'd never been good at a bluff. His fingers traced her arm, leaving a trail of tingles. You'd share my bed? She rolled back and looked at the ceiling as her heart thundered. If she could trust any man, it was probably Dane. He was so different, but she hadn't expected this. She turned her head toward him and took his hand. Now I'm seeing this life you planned for us. He leaned on his side and met her gaze. Every night can be like last night. Emily wanted to just say yes and let the chips fall, but her own father flashed in her mind, stealing her joy. How he'd claimed to be too busy to take her in after her mother died. She nibbled on her lower lip. We're going to have to see, though. He turned and his muscular body brushed against her smooth skin. Why? What's holding you back? Admitting she was scared bloomed like a warning sign in her mind, and she shook her head. She was nothing like her mother, who chose loser guys, and Dane was honorable and way better than her father had ever been. She knew that without a doubt. I like to be useful. I don't want to be a housewife. Not yet. This time he laughed, and his voice was deep and demanded her attention as he said, I would expect nothing less. If only this was possible. She patted his cheek. Dane, we're just dreaming. His gaze narrowed like he saw straight through to her soul. Why? You can tell me what's going on in that head of yours. The night she'd called her dad when her mother hadn't come home and the police showed up at the house replayed in her mind. When she'd learned her mother had died, her father still hadn't come. Sophie had been the only one to hug her. Then she remembered in the same moment how Dane had walked away after prom and never called. She lowered her lashes to avoid his direct gaze. You left me once. I don't know how to fix that hole in my heart. He lifted the sheet and looked at her chest. I left a hole? Where? Her pulse slowed down. Maybe she needed to not hold Dane accountable for her father. She looked up into his eyes. Silly. Yeah, I had such a huge crush on you. I didn't know that. He kissed her knuckles. Emily was good at pretending nothing bothered her in life. She sat up and stretched her arms. That's because I'm tough, I've noticed, but you're also sweet. He sat and joined her hip to hip. Doubtful. A tremble raced through her. Sweet wasn't her. You must have noticed Michael's training. Not what I was talking about. He winked, but then let out a sigh. But I'm glad he was good to you. Perhaps his biological father wasn't the best conversation for first thing in the morning, but she pressed her hand on Dane's thigh. He'd be good to you too. He might not approve of us. Dane crossed his legs in a yoga pose on the bed. The yoga stretches shocked her. No man she knew stretched with such precision. Emily ignored it and raised her eyebrow. And you'd care? Coffee would be a better wake-up call than exercise. She stood. He got out of bed too, and bowed his shoulders forward, then shook his muscles loose. I wouldn't, you would. Michael is not related to me. She headed to the small coffee pot in the room and picked up the glass carafe. Except through marriage to my sister. He followed her to the vanity and lifted his toothbrush from a small bag as he said, You always seemed close to your family. She poured the water inside and then started the machine. In a few minutes she'd have her delicious wake-up brew and then head out later to get a proper cup of café au lait since they were in France. While waiting for her coffee, she got ready in the bathroom. My dad left my mom, and when my mom died, he didn't want to take me in. My sister is the only constant, though when we met, I was giving her a hard time. I get that. For a while they were both silent as they readied themselves for the day. After they finished and he walked out in a white terry cloth bathrobe, he said, My mother was the only one to ever love me. My stepfather, he clearly never cared. He didn't know how. You are the only one who could understand that. We were both damaged. Dane understood exactly. She poured 2 cups of coffee. Dane, I'm glad you discovered archaeology. It allowed him to be honorable. He wasn't anything like Edmund. History has much to teach us. He took the offered cup, blowing on it to cool it before taking a swallow. When we were in Cairo, working in the Valley of the Kings, we uncovered a hidden tomb. Of course we shared that information with the authorities. I have a rock of that dig embedded in my watch as a way to remember that not every artifact or dig has been discovered. There is a lot to still find and do. Agreed, she sipped her coffee. Books offer different views on history and put together a puzzle based on findings. He put his cup on the cabinet and then went around her hotel room, picking up his suit from the floor. He straightened and stared at her with his legs braced. I mean it, Em. When this is over, move to Boston with me. I'm scared. She lowered her head, heat rising in her cheeks. In an instant he stood before her. I get that. She traced the open neck of his bathrobe and sucked in her breath. Maybe she could live happily ever after with Dane. He hadn't run out and he knew the real her. She met his gaze and said, If you're going to be there, I'll try. Good. He put his arm around her. Glad we settled that. His lips claimed hers for a fast kiss and she sighed, wishing to freeze this moment forever. He ended the kiss and then tugged on her bra and the hidden pocket. Let's get dressed so we can head to the bank before Ted. Emily pulled on a pair of navy slacks she'd ordered yesterday. Do you think the royal family will see us when we go to London to return the family jewels? He slung his suit over his forearm. She checked that her jewels were still in the hidden pocket, then adjusted the bra under her blouse and eyed her image in the mirror to make sure she looked fine as he asked, Do you want to meet them? Was he joking? I'd love to be invited to the palace. He walked beside her to the door. Why would that be important? It's the closest I'll ever be to being a princess. She tapped the muscles at his waist and laughed. He smoothed his hand down her silk blouse. Sweetheart, you live and breathe like you are a princess already. It was true that she liked nice things. I do like having money, but that's not the reason. Why then? They headed into the hallway and toward his room. As he opened the door, she said, Because I'm proud of the man you became. I'd like to see that goodness formally recognized. Though I understand that you don't want fame and don't need a fortune. I never want to disappoint. He pulled her into his room, with him. You better not. Her eyes fluttered closed as the door slammed behind her. Dane took her lips in a bruising kiss that showed his passion. Emily refused to let her old doubts come between her and Dane. Chapter 11. Dane stood in the lobby, dressed in his black t-shirt and dark jeans, and glanced out the glass door of the hotel, toward the limo that would take them to Paris. Henry was talking to Brady over his headset, and Emily returned to the group with 3 café au lait from the lobby's cafe and handed them out, first to Henry. His heart skipped a beat from her brief touch as she handed him his cup. He held it firmly. "Emily, this would be better if you just stayed at the hotel." She shook her head, sipped her latte and said, "I'm coming, end of story. I want you safe." He patted her arm. "Here, no one know their names or their identities." She was safe from whatever might happen at the bank, but only if she didn't join him. She shrugged him off and headed to the door. "I want you safe too. Besides, I'm better at self-defense, you need me." She marched out the door. He rushed after her and stopped her at the limo. "Emily, this isn't a joke." Henry passed them both and got inside the limo without interrupting them. She swallowed her coffee and didn't back down. "I'm not joking and we're wasting time here." She bypassed him and scooted inside the car. He glanced around and saw no one following them. He got in, forced himself to relax, and drank his coffee. No one said much as they drove into Paris. By the time they'd finished their beverages, the Champs d'Élysées came into view. Dane held Emily's hand the whole way. Henry broke the silence when he said, "Brady is checking the bank. Nothing unusual has been detected around the perimeter." Emily smiled at him and patted his arm. "Let's hope the Paris authorities have already stopped Ted and tossed him in jail. Then getting out of here will be no problem." Nothing about Ted struck him as easily caught. Perhaps he was being overcautious. But the silence just amped up his apprehension as they drove toward the bank. He simply said, "I don't like it. Get over it." They parked. Emily reached for the door like she didn't care about danger. She looked over her shoulder and said, "We're here, so let's go." He quickly jumped out as he remembered the last time he hadn't kept her close and how he'd thought she'd died. He scanned the area, nothing but sunshine on a nice autumn day. His rigid spine warned caution. He held Emily closer to him, and despite her display of confidence, she accepted his arm without complaint. Henry joined them and continued to talk into his headset to Brady. He led Emily to a shady spot under a tree. The first person he saw crossing the street was Brady, who had stayed in the hotel across from the bank. For now, all 4 of them were fine. Brady shook Henry's hand, then Dane's. Dane told Emily, "Have your jewels ready when I say to get them." "Fair enough." She smiled like they were going to a picnic rather than on a mission to recover stolen jewelry. "Let's go." They arrived at the bank within minutes, and Dane held the door for her and his friends, checking the street one more time. The quietness scratched at his skin worse than a shirt with its tags still on. Inside the bank, customers milled around the lobby or waited in line. Dane headed toward the special counter. This bank could easily blend in with any bank in any country, as nothing specific about it made it special, despite its long history. He took out his wallet and greeted the attendant. "Bonjour, we're here to open my safe deposit box." The clerk was dressed in a black suit, like the other employees, and sported a goatee. "Do you have the bank key?" "Brady, the key." Dane opened his palm toward his friend, and Brady dropped it in. In turn, Dane gave it to the banker, who scanned the code and then handed the key back. "Thank you, sir." The clerk typed something onto his computer and read the instructions. A split second later, the banker asked, "Do you have your identification and the mark needed to open the box?" "The jewelry again." He hugged Emily closer, ensuring no one could see her, and whispered, "Emily?" She wiggled so no one saw her reach into her bra and then slipped the necklace and earrings into his hand. "Here you go." He stepped back. Emily had been so smooth that he doubted even his friends had seen her slick move. Dane glanced around the bank one more time. Still nothing. Dane handed the jewels to the banker, who scanned the necklace into his computer like it had a secret barcode. He peered over the counter. The clerk had taken a digital picture. The banker returned the necklace and Dane handed it to Emily. "Can I have my box now?" Emily hardly moved a hair as she slipped the necklace back into her hidden pocket like she was getting her phone from her pocketbook. The banker walked around the desk and motioned for the group to follow him as he said, "This way." Henry held his hand to his ear like he was listening for something, but then said, "Let's go." Dane lifted his eyebrow as he guided Emily forward. Henry nodded like he understood the silent question. "The coast is clear so far." Still, Dane's muscles were tight and braced for defense. The banker went into a room full of silver metal boxes and took one off the shelf, handing it to Dane as he said, "This is your box, sir." "Thanks." He held the metal container close to his chest and didn't put it on the table until after the banker left. Dane's fingers trembled at what he might find as he unlocked the box. "Trouble? A hoax?" Emily peeked over his shoulder and asked. "Is it there, Uriel?" "Yes. Gorgeous." Nothing he'd ever dug from the dirt held this kind of luster at first sight. He lifted the diamond star and diamond badge, inspecting them closely, just as the books described. Almost 400 precious gems, 394 to be exact, were embedded in the design. He smoothed his thumb over the green shamrock made of emeralds, the red rubies along the border of the badge, and the motto written with pink diamonds. The star was composed of diamonds, enclosing a cross of rubies and a trefoil of emeralds surrounding a sky-blue enamel circle with words, Quis separabit MDCCL XXX3 in rose diamonds engraved on back. Everything was exactly as they were supposed to be. These are the missing jewels. He held them to his chest. Emily hugged him and squeezed tight. So we did it. Only after they returned these to England and went back to a routine life would the adrenaline stop rushing in his veins. Now we need to get out of here and head to my plane. Henry led them and Brady flagged behind. Emily bounced on her feet as they entered the lobby filled with bank customers and said, "This is very exciting. I never expected to be part of something so magnificent. Even more exciting? Once this is over, we can start that life we were talking about." Goosebumps grew on his arms and body as they walked onto the street. He tugged Emily faster and said, "Hurry!" Not even the wind blew a single leaf in a nearby tree. All four of them jumped into the limo Henry had ordered. The passerby all seemed more interested in window shopping than them as the driver took off down the street. Uriel's heart raced. Ted had to be close. This had been too easy. He didn't trust it. Henry listened into his headset and the devices he'd set up around the bank. As Brady scanned the police broadcasts, Dane asked, "What do you hear, Henry?" "Nothing from Ted," Henry said. "Just normal chatter. The limo is taking us to the airport as instructed." Brady settled into his seat. "Relax, everyone." Emily let out a small snort. "I don't know about relaxing, but we made it. I was half afraid I'd be kidnapped and driven around Paris again," which was why he'd refused to let her out of his sight. Brady then clapped his hands and asked, "Shall we break out the champagne for another job well done?" "No," Uriel said, as the zip in his pulse reminded him that danger was close. "Henry, are we being chased?" Henry shook his head. "Not that I can tell. The authorities must have caught Ted." Emily squeezed his hand and smiled at him, as if to calm him down. Maybe they were right, though the rush of adrenaline continued in his veins. He opened his mouth to apologize and glanced over Emily's shoulder. A silver bumper was inches from the glass window where Emily sat. He threw himself over her as the glass shattered and metal ripped around him. He screamed out, "Emily, duck! What's happening?" She clutched his arm. The crash ended and the limo spun crazily to a stop. He brushed the glass off his arms, careful of the metal bumper that had punched through the door. He pulled her to the other side of the limo and said, "Just stay down." Henry's door flew open and someone hit him. Brady was the first to defend his friend, but both men pulled the guy in that took a swing at Henry. Dane blocked Emily from the fight, but then Henry rolled out on the sidewalk and Brady went with him to stay in the fight. Emily held his shoulder, but he pushed forward to help. A fist connected to Dane's chin and forced him back. Dane jumped up with a fast punch to the man's nose. "Ted." He hadn't expected the man to have such a strong punch. "Did you actually think you'd gotten free?" Ted asked. This time Dane had a clearer shot to Ted's chest and he punched harder to keep his nemesis back. "Ted, you lost. You're now a wanted man on this continent. You've ruined your business reputation." Another man threw Ted a blunt metal baton and Ted took a swing at Dane's head. Dane went down to his knees as his head spun. "My client will need those jewels. Once I complete my task, my reputation will be golden. Goodbye, Uriel." A click of a gun echoed. Emily pulled on his back and said, "Dane." A burning pinch heated his arm as Emily tried to drag him behind the crumpled limo. From the corner of his eye, Dane saw Ted above them. "Duck!" He pushed Emily out of the way and a second later Ted knocked him down with the bat. The bat clinked as it fell beside his head. His ears rang. "I have it, Dane." Emily held up the baseball bat. Dane got to his feet and blocked another jab at his face. Ted reached out and grabbed the bat, and Emily, who wouldn't let go, holding her in a headlock. "Give me one reason not to kill this one." Emily, her frustrated expression just made her seem more angelic. She was his angel. Private collectors getting to keep the world's riches hidden away didn't matter nearly as much as her life. In an instant, Dane calmed and everything around him became slower as he said, "Because I have the jewels. She matters more to me." Ted jerked her backward as he said, "So you'll give them up?" "No, he won't." Emily struggled. Her face went white as Ted squeezed her. He held out the jewels for Ted to see as he said, Let her go, Ted." Clicks of a gun reverberated in the air and Ted let go of Emily as Ted's legs buckled. The man Henry and Brady fought with also stopped. Emily coughed but then pushed Ted's arms off her like she was holding him up. "Run, Dane, run. Get out of the way," Dane said, reaching for her as Brady and Henry's opponent almost knocked Emily down as he bolted down the road and out of sight. She hugged him and then stopped in horror, showing him the blood on her hand. "Dane, you've been shot too. You're safe?" He honestly didn't care that his arm stung. Emily held him as if he was about to fall down and said, "I won't let you die on me." His gaze narrowed. They needed to go before the police arrived. The limo was crushed. Henry ran toward a nearby truck parked on the side of the road while Brady checked their limo driver. "That isn't going to happen." Brady gave a thumbs up that the driver was okay. Dane asked, "Can you let up a little on hugging me? We need to go." Henry made hand signals for them to join him and Dane nodded, directing Emily to run. Henry's procured motorcycles. "Let's go." She refused to release him as if he might be crippled and unable to move on his own. She helped him on the back of a motorcycle they were borrowing thanks to Henry. Emily tried to take the front, but Dane pushed forward, motioning with his jaw that she was to sit behind him. She hopped on the back and asked, "Do you know how to drive one of these?" "Yes." He started the engine to make the motorcycle purr. She pressed on his wound to monitor any blood loss and apply pressure. He hoped the wind would clear his mind. Drivers, blocked by the accident, got out of their cars and surrounded Ted. Was he dead? Unconscious? Who had shot Ted? As they took off, she said, "We did it." Brady had the limo driver behind him on his motorcycle, which meant they needed to stop at the hospital, an unwanted delay but necessary. If possible, they'd switch out the motorcycles there for a car. His mind raced. "Don't say that until we're on the plane." Emily held him tighter as they made their way toward the hospital, but then Henry slowed his motorcycle from the lead and shouted, "Our airplane is compromised." He'd thought it had gone too easy. First they needed a hospital, then they'd get out of here. He'd hoped to question Ted about who his buyer was, but that wasn't happening. "We can take a ship back to London," he answered Henry. Pain lanced through him and he gritted his teeth. "We'll have to drive through Normandy." "Okay." Henry's stoic expression gave nothing away and he returned to point. Emily yelled, "I want Uriel seen by a doctor. He was shot." Thankfully, Henry didn't hear her. "I'm fine, Em." He revved the engine. She hugged him and said, "Yeah, no, but you will be. You're always my angel." He stayed on Henry's tail. She was right about the hospital, but he'd rather deal with the injury after he handed over the jewels. But for now they'd escaped. They'd won. It was enough. Chapter 12. By the time they reached the closest hospital, the blood was dry on Dane's arm. It had to hurt, though Emily was impressed at how he handled the injury so calmly. Emily had a low pain tolerance and had screamed bloody murder for a flu shot. He waited patiently outside as Brady brought the limo driver into the emergency room. She brushed her hand over Dane's good arm and then gently nudged him as she said, "Go in, we're just dropping off the driver." He stayed still as Henry spoke to the police in the parking lot, giving a full report on Ted Vetsan, from the bank incident to the shootout. If Dane didn't get help, who knew what type of infection he'd get? She more forcefully shoved him toward the entrance, though he was a wall of hard muscles. "No, you're going to be seen by a doctor. Ted might find us." He shook his head and just stared at the door as if willing Brady to hurry. If something happened to him, she'd never forgive herself. She pointed to the police car, where Henry was still talking to a pair of officers. "The police don't seem to be in a rush. A new car is on its way. Just go see how long of a wait it might be, Sairpool." He walked closer to the door but hedged, like he was unsure. She was about to escort him in when Brady finally came out and said, "I've found a doctor who's willing to take your case for cash." Dane glanced at both of them in defeat. "Fine, but he has to be fast. We can't be seen as I don't want to answer any more questions." Brady nodded. "Done." Dane still didn't move and she said, "Once someone looks at your arm, we can run as fast as you want." He squeezed her hand. "Emily." "Yeah?" She swallowed and hoped he wouldn't continue to argue with her. He released her. "Just wait outside with Henry." "You don't want me to come?" She took a step to go with him. "Henry will get you out of France if we are separated." He strode forward, his mind made up. "I'll see the doctor alone." Okay." She stared at him as he walked inside. Her body felt cold as ice as his broad shoulders disappeared from view. He didn't even look back. If she was alone she might cry, and she never cried. Not being invited meant he didn't want her with him, and the thought stung worse than a bee. Ultimately men left, right? The thought creeped in and she shook it off as she joined Henry, who was just wrapping things up with the French authorities. Brady signed for the rental car Henry had ordered, and scrolled through his phone as they waited. What felt like an eternity later, Dane walked out of the hospital and headed right toward her. Brady got behind the wheel and Henry sat in the front passenger side. Dane took her hand, directing her in the back. His strength reverberated in his tight grip. "Let's go." "What did he say?" She stepped into the car. Dane flashed the bandage and said, "Flesh wound, a couple stitches, that's all. You pulled me out at the perfect time." "Good." She let the thought he'd be fine wash through her and released a slow breath. Brady drove them back onto the main road. Dane reached into his back pockets where he'd shoved the Irish crown jewels, once meant to highlight British power in Ireland, and showed the two jeweled pieces Henry and Brady, then to her. "Let's get this to England." She held the badge in her palm. Over 100 years ago, a group of thieves had studied meticulously to get these jewels. She'd always assumed whoever had them had ripped the jewels apart for all the small diamonds and other precious stones. Emily stared at the symbols of royalty that the Irish had viewed as symbols of oppression as they sparkled in the setting sun. These needed to be in a museum for the world to remember, just as Dane wanted. She gave them back and saw they'd entered a port. Brady parked. Dane opened the rear passenger door, got out, pocketed the jewels and offered his hand to help her out of the car. "Emily, let's go." She saw the steam engine ferry and heard the whistle warning the ship was going to leave any moment. Passengers were on their phones and minding their own business. They had no idea the trouble Ted had caused. Dane held her hand as they made their way onto the ship. Henry directed them downstairs to a private stateroom, away from the passengers who milled around during the short trip across the channel. The room was small, but the bed in the middle had white sheets and fluffy pillows. She tossed her bag on the small dresser with an old-fashioned bowl and pitcher as Dane sat down and untied his sneakers, kicking off his shoes. Henry and Brady left to scout for danger, and Dane fell onto the bed. She sucked in her breath and asked, "Are you okay?" "It's been a long day." He closed his eyes. "I'm tired, Em. The fight, the accident, driving the motorcycle, and being shot in a day would be exhausting." She fixed the sheets, tempted to rest next to him when she heard a vibration from her pocketbook. She picked up her phone and read the screen. "My sister's calling," Dane snored as his reply. "Right." She walked over to a small porthole as the engine chugged them out of port and quickly answered, "Sophie." Her sister made a loud sigh and launched her questions. "Emily, where are you? Are you okay? Why didn't you call me or answer before?" She turned behind her and heard Dane's soft snore. She licked her lips and her stomach had nervous butterflies as she said, I'm with Dane." "Michael's Dane?" Sophie asked. Emily braced for impact as she said, "Yeah." Her sister then hummed and asked, "He was at the nightclub?" Emily's face heated as she slumped on the other side of the bed, her legs facing the porthole in case she needed to jump up for cell service. Yeah, I met him there." "But?" Sophie gave a long snort. "Emily, I can tell something's wrong." Caught. She closed her eyes and tried to stop the impulse to tell her sister everything, but then Sophie would worry when she couldn't help. It was best to wait. "Everything's just been intense." "Intense?" Sophie repeated like she was their mom. Then she asked with her more normal, sister tone. "As in, you are fine and this is relationship stuff?" "Kind of." Emily opened her eyes and looked over her shoulder at sleeping Dane. He honestly was a prince amongst men. He was sexier, stronger, buffer, sweeter, made her body sing with happiness, but the memory of waking up and him telling her goodbye, that he had to go, floated in and wouldn't leave. Emily could imagine her sister with her eyebrows up, giving her the "we wear pink on Wednesdays" stare. Sophie saw the world in her own way. Sophie asked, "What does that mean?" "It means I like Dane," Emily admitted to her wide-eyed, optimistic, should have been a fairy tale princess, older sister. Sophie didn't yell but laughed. "Yeah, I remember you making googly eyes at him." "Sophie, I don't make googly eyes." Emily shook her head as her mind searched for some witty comeback. "At Dane you did," Sophie said like it was a guaranteed win on a lottery ticket. "Where is he?" "I know Michael said he was doing fine on his own, and wanted to respect the distance, but it always bothered him that Dane never came back." "Right, his father, Emily's brother-in-law. This should be all sorts of wrong," but she looked at Dane, resting soundly, and the bandage on his arm from being shot while trying to return stolen jewels. He was nothing like she'd thought. He matched her, and in more than just a physical way. He'd even worn the suit she'd bought him without complaint to please her. Dane's a professor at Harvard now. A professor? Dane always struck me as an intellectual underneath that pain of his. Sophie's voice flittered off. Emily imagined her sister was probably swept away by some romantic gesture like Michael had given her flowers while she was on the phone. Her sister was a sucker for roses that die in vases because they'd been cut. Sophie returned her attention to the phone and said, "Well, that's good to hear, but you're in France?" "Okay." They'd talk when she got back. Dane said he'd come home with her to see his father. "We flew out to Paris for a romance?" Sophie asked. Her sister was always the romantic one. Emily never really sought out men or attention. She never trusted anyone, though Dane had snuck inside her heart and she cared for him. She stood and glanced out the porthole as they chugged along the choppy waters. "I don't know," Sophie quickly stated her opinion. "Why? What don't you know? You either like him or you don't." Emily turned around again. The room was tiny, but she pressed her hand against her bra and knew the necklace he'd given her years ago was still there. She'd kept it and wore it because it was the only way to really feel like she belonged to him. And then he'd just appeared like a vision back in her life, saving her, like he'd never left. But he had. The hole in her heart was still there. She shook her head and tried to ignore her feelings. "It's probably fine, but you know going fast doesn't work out," Sophie countered, like she'd read her mind. "Going slow doesn't either, so what speed are we talking here?" "I'm just scared, Sophie," Emily admitted. Maybe her sisters might get it. None of their fathers had shown up to their mom's funeral, or for them. Sophie asked. Then again, Sophie was the bright-eyed optimist who only ever saw the good in everyone. Maybe she didn't understand. Emily's stomach was full of butterflies as she held her waist. "What if he leaves again? What if he doesn't?" Sophie asked so fast the words felt like she'd just spit them out on auto-reply. Trust was a good thing. Sophie had landed a man seriously in love with her because she'd trusted. Maybe Emily could channel a little of her sister's optimistic princess behavior where cute woodland animals did her bidding. Actually no, Emily wasn't that sweet. She laughed at the imagery. "So you're saying everything might work out?" Sophie asked. "Do you want to bring home another loser that you know you don't really want?" "Loser?" Emily sat straighter and set herself up to argue. "Greg wasn't the—" "Yeah, even you didn't like him," Sophie interrupted. Dane snored as he turned. Unlike Greg, Dane was everything she'd ever wanted. She brushed her fingers over his hand. "You're right, I didn't. So give Dane a chance," Sophie said, while Dane took her hand and held it in his sleep. Lying next to him, just for a little bit, might be good. She didn't want anyone else. She swallowed and slipped her feet out of her shoes. "Will that be okay with Michael?" Sophie said. "He'll probably approve, but does that matter?" Her brother-in-law wasn't exactly her go-to for most valued opinion on the planet, though he'd ensured they were all taken care of financially. The ship's engines suddenly shut off and they stopped moving. Emily's heart raced as she told her sister, "No, Soph, I have to go." "Okay." Sophie hung up. Emily brushed her hand up and down Dane's arm. Goosebumps raised as she heard the ship power down. She whispered, "Dane, wake up. What's going on?" He sat up immediately. How did he not know? Adrenaline rushed through her as she said, "Listen." Emily slipped her shoes back on and stood to get her pocketbook as Dane asked, "To what?" "Listen closer." She looped her bag around her shoulder and pushed his shoes toward the bed. He put his sneakers back on as he shook his head. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly." She pointed him toward the small sink. Dane splashed water on his face, used the leather of his wallet to buffer the small jewels in his pocket, and then met her gaze with a dawning light in his expression. "Oh, that's not good." "Yeah." She mentally prepared for whatever happened next. "Who was Greg?" Dane asked as he opened the door. Neither Henry nor Brady waited for them outside the door. "Not good either." She followed Dane out as she said, "A guy I brought home 3 years ago for Thanksgiving, but honestly no one important. Too bad I missed dinner." They walked slowly to the stairs. "Emily, this time don't do anything, I mean it. I was good last time." They stopped at the bottom step and Dane listened to sounds above them. She'd saved him from a worse injury if not his life. "You don't." A gunshot sounded above deck. Dane pushed her behind him like he'd protect her from any stray bullet and whispered, "Stand back." "Not again, not this soon." She couldn't lose Dane. "You might be hurt worse if I hadn't acted. Still, this could be dangerous. I want you to be safe." He walked her back to their room. No, this wasn't the best hiding spot. If there were thieves on the ship, then the first classrooms would be targeted. "I'll be careful." "That doesn't make me feel better." Once inside, he closed the door behind him, locked it, then turned and said, "Look, Emily, you're the closest thing I'll ever have to a girlfriend, and it's my job to protect you." Doubting him was her mistake. Tears formed in her eyes, though she wouldn't cry. She wasn't the emotional type. "I'm your girlfriend?" One eyebrow rose. "Is that a problem?" "No." He stepped toward the door and she grabbed his good arm, her hand on her hip. "No, but if you're my boyfriend, you need to promise me one thing." "What's that?" He unlocked the door. Had he realized they needed a better hiding spot? She swallowed. Dane was important, he had to know that. But all she said was, "Don't get killed over jewelry." He stepped into the hallway. "Says the woman who refused to give up that necklace." That was different. The necklace was all she'd had of Dane. "You gave it to me, I'm sentimental." His lips met hers and for 1 second the world faded away. As the kiss ended, Dane directed her backwards a little. "Good, now, I'm sorry for this." "For what?" She tilted her head. The kiss had been magical. He stiffened his shoulders as he said, "For this." With a quick movement he closed the door in her face and locked it from the outside. She tried to turn the handle but it didn't move. "Let me out." He dragged what was probably a chair and shoved it under the knob of the door. "You're safer here, I'll be right back." "Dane, don't do this." She tried the handle again, but it didn't budge. Her heart raced. If anything happened to Dane, she'd never forgive herself. He was hers and she wanted to see how far things developed together. If he died over jewels, then she'd never ever be able to look herself in the mirror because she hadn't been able to save him. Chapter 13. Dane made it to the top deck of the steamboat that transported people across the English Channel who didn't want to go through the tunnel. Many were tourists, but a few were locals who shuttled between Normandy and England, and many British accents whispered about commotion and Americans with their guns. Dane poked his head into the crowd of passengers huddled together and searched everywhere on deck for Ted. Around him, families, groups of friends, or complete strangers were all transfixed on the back-on of the ship. Dane slowly transitioned his own attention there. A gun fired and the crowd screamed. Dane's entire body was alert on adrenaline. Folks around him backed up, but he inched his way forward. Whatever had happened, he needed to know and protect Emily from it. As he made his way through the crowd, keeping his head down to not be seen, he heard another shot in the air. People screamed and clutched their children. No one else needed to die, not over jewelry. He went toward the sound and saw Brady on the edge of the banister of the ship as Ted held a gun to his head. Underneath the ledge, 2 men pinned Henry down. Ted motioned with his gun toward a boat behind them and shoved Brady's shoulder. "Get in." Brady almost slipped, but he didn't follow Ted's deranged orders. Ted pointed his gun at the passengers, specifically an Asian woman and her young son holding an ice cream cone, and said, "Uriel Dalligatti, I know you're here." The boy asked, "Who?" "Uriel, come on out, or I will shoot Professor Brady Booker." Brady had lost his glasses in the scuffle and squeezed his eyes closed in preparation for a shot. "No." Dane's heart pounded that this was a mistake, but he called out, "Wait." The mostly English crowd parted as he thought fast on his feet. "The crown jewels of England are that important for you to steal?" A few British voices murmured loudly, "Crown jewels?" Ted pointed the gun toward him. "There you are, hand them over now." Murmurs of nationalistic pride whispered around him, and just maybe he could use that to create a diversion. He held out the Irish crown jewels and showed them to Ted and everyone who watched as he said, "I intended to give these stolen jewels back to the authorities once we cross the channel." Ted gave Brady a hard push backward. Brady swayed dangerously close. Ted's men on the boat below waited to capture him, but Brady regained his balance. Dane handed over the jewels in exchange for his friend. Brady, the 2 thugs who'd pinned Henry down, released him and jumped off the ship to the waiting craft below. The English people on board voiced their concerns. Ted leapt off the rail to the other boat's deck. Henry glowered as he eyed the retreating vessel. Brady squinted to see without his glasses. Dane ran to the edge. As Ted's vessel moved away from the ferry, his nemesis began to laugh and point at something tied up on deck. He grinned, giving his wrinkles more creases, and held up the jewels. "Uriel, look what else I have." Dane would know that blonde bob anywhere. "Emily." She looked at him with round blue eyes but didn't make a sound. Her mouth was covered. He'd failed. He yelled, "Let her go. I gave you what you wanted. Your girlfriend caused us all too much trouble." Ted dipped his head and took a bow. "Good day, Uriel." His heart practically exploded in his chest. He'd failed Emily. He'd made the wrong choice. This was all his fault. She'd made him say that jewels weren't important. He knew she had her own valuable necklace and earrings that would earn a high price. If that was the goal, hopefully she'd hand them over and protect herself from the danger he'd put her in. His temples throbbed. Henry brushed off his jeans, his elbow on the rail. "You just handed over the crown jewels?" He hadn't realized that Emily had been kidnapped. On the other side of Henry, Brady nursed a sore arm, his face a mask of pain. Dane scowled and shielded his eyes from the sun to peer at the boat in the distance. Emily was getting too far away. "I thought I was making a trade for Brady. Obviously it was a distraction to get Emily too. We'll get them back." Henry motioned toward a motorized lifeboat. "Good plan." He walked to the side and helped Henry untie the lifeboat and lower it as he said, "No, we get Emily back." Brady tried to help, but winced when he grabbed the hard rubber. "That's good to hear." Dane couldn't stop staring at the boat. He should have jumped into the ocean, though he'd never swim that fast. His mind raced with all the terrible things that might happen as the three men lowered the lifeboat into the water. The crew approached with angry faces. The engines shook the ferry as it rumbled back on to complete its voyage. He'd let Henry handle any talking, as he told Brady. "This was all my fault. I shouldn't have left her alone." His friend's eyes watered slightly, though he pretended to be fine. "Brady, what did you hurt?" "I thought your arm, but I don't see anything." Brady lifted his hand and showed how his broken fingers listed at odd angles. "I'm going to have to work on speech-to-text software for the time being. Stay here and deal with the authorities, Brady. Then get to a hospital," Dane told him. He'd rescue Emily alone, but as Henry cleared the lifeboat with the crew, another idea flew into his mind. If he succeeded in getting Emily back, then she needed to be safe. And if he needed backup, there was only one person who had the capabilities to assist. Dane held up his finger and took a step back. "I have to make a phone call." Brady stared at him in astonishment. "Who are you calling?" He dialed, and the phone rang. Dane's body tensed. Time was of the essence, but so was backup. "Someone I should have called when Ted showed up at the nightclub with a gun." "Who?" Brady asked again as the phone clicked and Dane heard a quick intake of breath. His biological father was smart and quick-thinking enough to get Emily to safety. "My father," he cleared his throat and said in the speaker. "Michael, it's Dane." His biological father's voice was deep and hard to figure out, especially over the phone as he said, "Dane, it's good to hear from you." The best thing to do was spit this out. Dane watched Ted's boat get farther out of sight. Henry finished clearing the lifeboat with the officers and returned to work on the ropes as Dane said, "Emily's been kidnapped. It's my fault." "By who?" his father asked. To sum up his life and the last few days in as few words as possible made his muscles tighten. He helped with the rope on the pulley. "Ted Vet-san, he's on a small boat heading back to Paris with her right now. I don't know who's paying him to steal jewelry Edmund left me in a security box, but they want the stolen British jewels my parents had in the bank. We intended to return the jewels to the British authorities and Emily wanted to come. But now Ted has those and Emily." Without bombarding him with more questions, Michael said, "We'll meet you in France. I'll figure out who the enemy is and how we can get Emily." Dane waved goodbye to Brady and headed into the orange lifeboat with Henry as he said, "Find my friend Professor Brady Booker a computer. And with his phone he can help me stay in touch. I'd appreciate it." "Got it." Michael hung up like he'd received an order and was ready to go. He'd done the right thing. His biological father had the resources and talent to formulate a rescue. In this first contact, neither of them had become sentimental and they'd stayed focused. Dane shoved the phone in his back pocket, and Henry worked the motor. As the small craft separated from the main ferry, Henry directed them after Ted's boat and said, "So that's your plan? You called your father?" "Yeah." Henry had no idea how Michael and Jack worked as a team, and Dane didn't want to relive his youth with an explanation. His father knew how to protect himself and his family, and Emily was more his family anyhow. We go after Emily and save her, but afterward I needed someone to take her home and out of danger." Henry stared at him like he'd just spoken gibberish. "Won't she want to come with you? You seem taken with each other." Taken was a good word for how he felt near Emily. No other woman would ever match her, but she deserved more. She deserved to be happy without danger hounding her heels. "I'm better off alone. Emily deserves better than me." Henry found a way to increase their speed with the small engine they had and asked, "Doesn't the lady get to decide that for herself?" If Emily wanted to stay with him, he'd welcome her, but he seriously doubted that would be her choice. He'd left her alone and defenseless. This was his mistake and she'd hate him. She had always been a small part of why he wanted to help the world, and he couldn't sit still while she was ripped from it. Emily needed to be safe and go home in one piece. Water from the channel splashed against his face. They traveled toward the beaches of Normandy again as he said, "One day, Henry, you'll understand." At least they hadn't gone very far and the small lifeboat zipped across the surface. Henry said fast, "The boat is in port, broadside. If we hurry, figure out their direction, then we're only 10 minutes behind them." "Let's go," Dane answered. Somehow he'd get Emily back. He couldn't fail again. Chapter 14. "This is how I die," Emily panicked, with a black bag over her head so she couldn't see. They'd brought her below deck and tied her arms and legs to a metal table that swayed with the moving of the ocean. Salt itched at her throat while water and darkness surrounded her head. The water stopped forcing itself into her lungs. Then she could breathe. Ice ran through Emily's body, and at last the bucket stopped pouring water into her mouth. She coughed and spit out salty water, shivering, gasping, and then another bucket rained over her lips, forcing water into her and stopping her breaths. Michael hadn't trained her for this. Her vision swam. She must have lost consciousness, so she had no idea how much time had passed. Emily rolled over to cough out more water. She wasn't dead, not yet. This time she could turn to her side and clutched her stomach even with her hands in cold metal cuffs, unable to fight. Things couldn't get worse. Then, from the other side of the metal table, she heard a masculine voice say, "Hello, Emily." There was no mistaking the French accent. She spluttered and coughed. It was like she was on the train again, kidnapped and held against her will. The sway of the ocean under her body, rather than train tracks. She was on a ship still, and the black bag was pulled from her face. Her eyes stung, but she sat up as hands roughly pushed her to a sitting position and brought her from the table to a hard-backed chair. Ankles tied, wrists tied, her vision began to return and she saw she was on the deck of a ship while she swiped off the male hand from her side and met the furious brown eyes of Alexander, Ted's henchman. Her lip quivered. "Back off." He squatted in front of her and his stare alone made her tremble as he said, "Your boyfriend couldn't save you." Hopefully her cold shivering had disguised that tremble that she slipped out of the ropes that were meant to bind her. She didn't reveal that, but it was time to be brave. She coughed again but lifted her chin. "He didn't save me the last time either, if you remember." Alexandra traced her cheek and chin and sneered at her. "You drugged me. I was trying to escape." She pushed his hand off her face and shook her head. "Henry gave the authorities your names and crimes. You can't go home without being arrested. You freed yourself, I see. I must not have been rough enough for you." Alexander caressed her elbow. "I thought we were getting along." Enough. She needed to get off this boat and escape. She had to keep calm and be ready to run. She cupped her hands into fists and wished she'd freed her ankles as easily. "If you had a chance to escape certain death, wouldn't you take it?" Alexandra brushed against her arm but then stood up as he said, "C'est suffisant. Here comes the boss." She swallowed. Ted had no problem shooting people. What did he want with her? The ship docked. If they were on land, she'd have more opportunity to run. She stilled as Ted came in and leaned against the small bar in the room as he showed her the ceremonial star and badge he'd taken from Dane. Dane never should have locked her in. He'd made her a sitting duck for Ted's henchmen. She'd find her freedom and they could discuss it later. Her mind instantly whipped to Ted as he tapped the bar and said, "Miss Mira, I'll need the necklace you possess. This time the real one and not the fake you that you pawned off in the crypt." "Boss, the French authorities have our identities and photographs," Alexander said. Hopefully she'd planted seeds of doubt in Alexandra. Michael always said confusion was a weapon to wield against an enemy. Adrenaline made her hyper-aware of her jewelry hidden in her bra pocket. "My necklace, that's on the ship with Uriel." His gaze narrowed and he walked toward her with his hand out. "You're lying." Her face heated. Darn, evasion was easier. Her words came fast as she shook her head. "I'm not good at lying. You kidnapped me when I was taking a nap." Ted snapped his fingers and she winced, remembering when he'd shot her friends. "My men searched the room and it wasn't there, which means you have it somewhere. Alexander will find the real necklace on you." Alexandra ran his hand down her sides, including her breasts, as she struggled. "Let me go." Ted laughed at her but didn't stop Alexandra. "Let me be clear. Alexandra is upset that you drugged him and wants to rape you as punishment." Her heart froze. No, no, no. She needed to escape. They were docked. She needed to distract and dash as Michael would have instructed. Her brother-in-law always said that the mind was the best weapon. She made eye contact with Alexandra. "I thought you loved your wife and wanted to go home and have breakfast with her." Hopefully she'd painted the right mental picture because Alexandra paused and dropped his hand from her hip. The only way this doesn't happen is if you hand over the necklace and earrings, Ted said. The jewelry was all she'd ever have of Dane in the end. He wouldn't stay. He hadn't stayed before and wouldn't now. She shook her head and said, I don't. Alexandra, Ted snapped, and Alexandra ripped at her shirt. She pressed her elbows to his hands to knock him off her as she leaned back in the chair. It moved an inch on the wooden planks. She eyed the door behind both men. Could she make it past them, with a distraction? Wait, okay, you can have your necklace. She reached into her bra and removed the jewelry, flashing it in front of her. Now you can let me out of here and no one gets hurt. It's not me, Alexandra, keeping you from your wife. Emily slowly scooted her chair closer to the exit. Ted asked, What do you mean? She held the necklace next to her still, thinking of her sister and Michael. Surely Dane would have called him, right? Okay, the two men hadn't talked in 10 years, but they'd both want to rescue her. Adrenaline raced through her as she said, My family will do whatever it takes to get me back. Ted reached for the necklace. Is that supposed to mean anything? No. She glanced at Alexandra, a Frenchman with a hook for a nose, whose face grew darker as he listened to something on his radio. Hopefully she'd caused friction. Ted walked around her and the hair on her body stood on its ends. She clutched her necklace as she said, You had to trick Uriel to get to him, but he and his friends are smarter than you give them credit for. He'll find me. Ted pried the necklace from her fingers and she had to let go, or risk breaking it. He pocketed her jewelry. But will your hero be in time to save you? That's the question you can't answer. The dock was only 10 feet away. If she was free of restraints, she imagined how she'd run to her freedom and get help. Alexandra had returned to monitoring what was probably the police lines, but she scooted her chair backward another inch and said, If I'm harmed, he will murder you both in your sleep. Revenge is a family trait and you don't want to be on the end of that cat and mouse game that runs in Uriel's veins. I sleep with a gun, Alexandra said with a growl. From nowhere he tightened his hold against my shoulders, sending pain shooting through her. Using her body weight, she bounced in her chair and the chair leg landed on his toe. He let her go, she said. That will make it easier for him then. He won't have to bring his own. Ted grinned at Alexandra. At least she's good for a laugh. Something rocked the boat. Alexandra pressed his lips together as he listened to whatever the police broadcasted into his ears. Ted knelt in front of her as he asked, What's going on? She scooted toward the gangway like she might escape, but Ted knocked her chair backward and by extension her too until he reached down and held her neck tight. She struggled and wished she'd been cut free, but then she heard Dane's voice as footsteps echoed on the deck. Give up, Ted. Let Emily walk away from this. Ted pulled her close and pressed a cold cylinder toward her neck, a gun. Sweat grew on her back as Ted said, You're both so naive, that isn't how this works. Alexandre stood beside her so she was flanked on either side by the enemy. Henry waited next to Dane with his gun drawn and pointed at Ted while Dane said, Ted, don't be foolish. Ted backed toward the gangway with her. Listen, Dane Pearce. I know your father killed your mother in front of you. No wonder you're all screwed up, which makes you easy to outmaneuver. I'll make this simple. If you don't have your man put down his weapon, Emily dies. Let her go. Dane waved for Henry to lower his gun. Ted pressed the gun into her skin as he said, I'd rather watch her bleed. Dane stepped toward them, hand outstretched. Wait, don't shoot Emily. At least he cared. If she died right now, at least she knew he cared. Her heart thumped as Ted said, You don't have anything I want to trade. Dane took another step closer and was now less than a foot from her as he said, You're right, I don't, but I'm sure I'll locate something else you want in the near future. You've now stolen from me 3 times. Her gaze met his and every cell in her body craved to be in Dane's arms again, which meant, create a distraction. She toppled her chair to the right just as a bullet rang in the air. Everyone froze in that second and she braced herself for pain. However, she felt fine. Ted gripped his stomach as he said, Then Ted went face down into the floorboards. Emily wiggled and Dane raced to untie her as she was sideways on the ground. The moment he freed her, she flung her arms around him. He asked, What happened? Are you okay? Alexandra scooped up her jewels and jumped off the ship into the water and a waiting jet ski. She screamed out, Alexandra! The thug waved goodbye. Now I have the jewels, the contract, and I get to do what I want. No! Dane would leave her and that necklace was all she'd have. She chased Alexandra the length of the boat like she might jump on the back, but he sped away into the misty English Chanel. Dane was right behind her and hugged her to stop her as he said, Emily, perhaps chasing the man who'd been told to kill her wasn't the smartest thing she'd ever done. Emily turned toward Dane and swayed a little. I'm okay. No, that's a lie. He held her closer. I feel like I just got kicked in the stomach. Let's get you to a hospital, Dane said. Why? She wasn't hurt, she needed her necklace back. When Dane left, she'd want the reminder again. She left his arms and shook her head. No, I'm sad about my necklace, Dane, but I'm glad you're here. He looked at her with concern. Your necklace? Yes, you were almost killed. Dane didn't move a muscle. Maybe he didn't understand. Men leave, he'd leave, even if he cared right now, nothing lasted. She hugged her waist and pointed to Henry, who was talking into his phone, planning their next step. Ted was, instead of me, Alexandra intends to sell the jewels, rather than Ted, to fulfill the contract. I'm good enough to go, but we'll need a weapon to counter his gun. Dane pointed to his bandaged arm and nodded, which made her look at her own as he said, You're bleeding. Huh? She was. She must have scraped against something and she'd have a bruise. She shrugged as she didn't feel anything. I'll heal, Dane shook his head without asking his question. Instead he said, we can forget about the jewels and just go home. Absolutely not. Her necklace was too precious. Her heart thundered now as she shifted and licked her lips. Dane, what's gotten into you? I want my necklace back. Why? He held out his hands. She took them and brought them to her heart. Why didn't he understand her? She held his warm hands and she relaxed a fraction. If they lasted forever, then maybe she didn't need his gift. But that wasn't possible. Telling him she didn't believe he'd stay wasn't good either. Emily sighed. Because it's pretty, and all I will have in the future to remember this adventure. Emily, he hugged her. His muscles were like a wall of protection. She let him go and said, Dane, have Henry stay and deal with the police. You and I need to go after Alexander. They both looked to the upper deck. Dane asked, Henry? Henry waved them off like he'd overheard everything they'd said. I'll catch up with you once this is all over. He pointed toward Ted on the deck. I have to stay. Dane squeezed her hand. I'm all yours, Emily. Good. She pulled him to follow her. They needed to get her necklace. She needed to remember him forever. He ran next to her on the edge of Ted's boat as she stared out into the channel. He said, You're my prize. It's not the crown jewels that are important. Had he just said that? She leapt off the boat to the ramp leading to the parking lot. No, Ted. Just dust of a car speeding west. She pulled Dane close. I don't need the necklace. I was being emotional. Forget it. Just kiss me. Done. He claimed her lips in a blazing kiss. She wished she believed in happily ever afters, but happy for now was all she'd get. She knew better than to expect anything else. Chapter 15. Dane's shoulders began to slump as he drove the rental car down the country road, searching for Alexandra. There was no sign of any car anywhere, and it was getting dark. Emily curled her legs under her seat beside him with a yawn, but then turned the music up high as if fighting weariness herself. What? Nothing. She lowered the music in defeat. We should probably rely on the officers to catch Alexandra and get the jewelry back. Is that what you were going to say? For the past hour he'd driven in circles at her directive, but her yawn was contagious. If they waited, his father might have a better tracking system. It was important to reserve their energy. He clutched the steering wheel. If he doesn't, I'll buy you a new necklace. She pouted like she was still the 16-year-old he'd met so long ago. It won't be the same. We'll push on for a little longer, he compromised. Whatever new necklace will be from me, to you, which is what you said mattered. He wondered if the reason she wanted that necklace so badly was because of prom. Had she cared for him all that time? She let out a long sigh of disappointment. I appreciate that. Have we tried down this road? Yeah. He braced himself for Emily's response to his next suggestion, but he was losing focus. He'd not slept in a day and neither had she. Emily, I think we lost him. No, she answered like she was shocked. Impossible that she couldn't see the truth. But he wouldn't let her down if he could help it. I'll drive all night if you want, but I think he's long gone now. We'll need to get coffee. Neither one of them said anything as it grew darker. The song came to an end and his phone beeped. He kept his gaze on the road, swerving around a shadowy rabbit. He glanced at the call. Emily bounced in her seat. Who is texting you? He'd missed a few and his father's name burned in his mind. He put his phone down in a cup holder. Henry, Brady, and Michael. She crossed her arms and turned toward him. Ah, you've been avoiding that question for hours, so you called your father. He glanced at her. Would she judge him? I was worried you'd be hurt. Thunder boomed in the distance as they headed toward a storm. Her voice was low as she said, We're running in circles, we can stop. Good. He picked up his phone and pressed the map button. In a few seconds they were guided toward the closest hotel, less than a mile away. "We can try again tomorrow." She stretched her legs in the passenger seat. "It will be nice to change." Lightning flashed in the sky. It was good they were getting off the road. "I feel like we lost everything. We have each other." He offered his hand. She took it and squeezed. "How is Brady?" "His fingers will heal, but he's wearing a cast on his hand." "I'm glad to hear that." He turned off the highway and saw a tall white building to the right. Emily said, "Let's tell Henry we're here and get him a room." "Right." He parked the rental car as more lightning flashed in the sky. They'd have to run for it. He opened his door and raced out, opening hers. "Still bossy," he said. "Part of your charm." She got out but stalled at the passenger door. Thunder crashed as she lifted her chin in defiance and said, "Look, you take me as I am or not at all." Rain began to pelt their skin. They ran toward the hotel next to each other as she refused to let him cover her head. Once they were under the building's awning, he asked, "Why is it always your way or nothing, Em?" She walked beside him but glanced up at him. "Are you complaining?" "I'm just asking." He held the door open for her. She passed and he headed toward the front desk. "Do you want your own room or to share?" Her eyes widened and she said, "My own." "Okay." He'd get 3 rooms for the night as Henry was on his way. He reached the check-in desk. Emily hurried to the counter and tugged on his arm. "No. Wait. We can share." "I don't want to fight. I'm sorry." "Fair." They were both tired. He smiled a little at her. "I don't want to force you to be with me. You aren't." She pushed her hair out of her face and smiled back, her shoulder to the hotel clerk. "I want to share. We should talk." "Talk?" Dane handed over his credit card and ordered 2 rooms, writing Henry's name and information down. When he was done, he tucked his arm around Emily's waist. "Okay, let's go." They walked toward the elevator and she lowered her voice so that he had to lean down to hear her. "Dane, one of the reasons I wanted the necklace so bad was because it's all I had of you for so long." The silver door opened and for the first time in hours he relaxed. Emily was 1 in a million. He didn't want to argue either. He followed her into the elevator. "See, now that's sweet, Em. I'm not always a harpy or hard." The doors closed. Fatigue hit like a tornado. He slumped against the back wall for support. "I never said harpy." "No, but that was the implication." Her shoulders hiked, like she wore metal spikes. The doors opened when they reached their floor. Whatever he'd done to her, he hadn't meant for her to be hurt. He waited for her to walk out and directed them toward their room. "Emily, when Ted had a gun to your throat, I'd have done anything to trade places. I'm not sorry he's dead." She nodded and said, "He was betrayed by his own. We all are eventually." That comment hit like a bullet. He swiped the room door open and held it for her to pass inside as he asked, "Emily, what's going on with you?" She rushed all the way into the room and immediately went to the bay windows, closing the blinds to avoid the storm outside that rattled against the glass pane. She turned toward him and hugged her waist. "Dane, now that we're just giving up and going home, I don't know if you and I will work out long term. I don't want either of us to be hurt." At that moment he couldn't move, and yet every cell in his body felt alive. She stared at him with chilly blue eyes. He was rigid and tight as he asked, "What are you saying?" "Nothing but the truth." He swallowed, deciding to end this conversation before it went too far. He was too tired to argue fair. He sat on the edge of the bed and untied his shoes. "Let's just go to bed." The pout on her face told him that she'd just spit out any second what she wanted to say. He stilled and glanced at her. "Or not. What is it, Emily?" She towered over him as he sat on the bed. She crossed her hands and stood taller, like she readied for a fight. "Relationships like ours don't work out." She didn't need a gun or bullets. His entire body tensed as he rose, making sure to look down at her. "How do you know?" She threw her hands in the air and paced the room. "What do you mean? What healthy relationship have you ever had?" Emily stopped and waited for his answer. He shrugged. "I thought this one might work out." She sucked on her bottom lip, and for 1 second he thought she'd apologize and they'd move on. But then she crossed her hands again. "For now. How long until we're both bored and want to go chase something or someone else?" Maybe she was irritable because she hadn't eaten or slept much. He backed toward the phone to call for room service as he said, "Emily, I've never chased a woman in my life." She followed him toward the nightstand like he was the prey she needed to slay. "Dane, I know we've all been easy for you." "Emily, you're not easy." Yes, his tone was defensive. Emily had never been that. His leg brushed against the edge of the bed and he stopped. Emily continued toward him, her mouth tight, her blue eyes cold. I guess I'm not, but it's better that we break up now, Dane. Emily knew how to rip out his heart and dance on his grave with those words. He stilled as he asked, break up? Are you serious? She nodded, and that affirmation was just another spike in his open, gaping wound. I don't want to move to Boston with you. I can't just walk around your house and not have a position. His mind couldn't process everything she said. He pivoted to move away from her as he shook his head. You'll get one, you're talented. She scoffed and ran her hand through her hair. At what? Writing history reports? I'll write about the Irish crown jewels, which we had in our hands and lost. I'm sure history journals will be lined up to read my failed work. Was this why she wanted to break up? Because they'd lost the jewels? She wanted to write a paper to get a job? He hadn't considered this. He rallied his weary body and pointed to the door. Do you want to chase Alexandra then? I told you I'd drive all night. Emily sat on the bed. We have no direction and I'm tired. Sleep was needed for both of them. He sat beside her as he said, but not too tired for this conversation. She turned on the bed and took his hand. No, Dane, the best thing for both of us is to stop any more relationship stuff. The sparks from her touch were clearly one-sided. He'd had no idea. He took his hand back and said, I can't force you to stay. No, you can't. She lowered her voice. A moment later, her phone rang. She stood and headed to her pocketbook he'd brought for her. Sophie's calling. His phone dinged and he read his father's text message. Emily looked at him from across the room and he nodded at her. Michael and Sophie have arrived, so your family is together. You'll be safe with them, but it's better if you go down the hall to them on your own. Don't leave the hotel, Emily said, and walked toward the door. Michael will want to see you and I don't want to interfere. Right. She'd done her best to kill him and now she was done. He followed her to the door to see her out. He was a sucker for believing they had a chance. As she opened the door, he asked, Emily, yeah? She paused in the threshold. I really wanted us to work out this time. I'm sorry. He brushed her arm one more time. If these flashes of desire were just in him, he had to let her go. She sighed, closed her eyes and leaned against the door, then glanced at him. Me too, Dane. Goodbye. She closed the door behind her and just like a rush of wind outside, she was gone. His mother had lied to him all his life. Emily had made him believe in the impossible, and that was obviously a lie. Maybe he was better off on his own. Women never trusted him with the truth. Chapter 16. Birds chirped outside the window. Emily blinked and covered her head to block the light as she dug into the bleached white sheets and down comforter at the hotel. The brightness of the day shone through open windows. She'd been too exhausted to open her windows last night, and now that she was listening, someone hummed in the background. Emily squinted into her room and saw her sister near the coffee maker as she hummed an old tune. Emily sat up and Sophie smiled at her as she said, You slept like the dead, Em. She glanced out the window and saw the sun was high in the sky. How long had she been asleep? Her sister must have been right because her mind was clear and her words last night to Dane seemed like she'd spit venom at him. She'd been so certain that she no longer needed false hope. She didn't need to cling to things that made her wish that one day Dane might come for her. 10 years was a long time. Her father had proven to her that she couldn't trust in any man. The only reason Dane had come back into her life was for his mother's necklace, and now it was lost. Chasing around the countryside half the night proved he cared more about the chase than actually her, right? Or that was silly as she'd told him she wanted it back, which made her the problem. She shivered as she scooted off the bed. Sophie, it's later than I thought. Sophie brought her a cup of coffee. You couldn't be woken, I'm glad you're okay. Okay. Last night could have been horrible. She could be dead or raped or who knows what, if Dane hadn't shown up and she treated him terribly. Emily sipped her coffee. The roast tasted somehow smoother here in France. She looked into the dark liquid and said, Dane risked his neck to save me. Sophie sat next to her, sipped her own coffee, and let out a sigh once she finished. Michael is disappointed that he missed seeing his son again. Last night she'd asked Dane to wait, but then again she hadn't been very nice to him. Not seeing him today was a dagger to her heart. This wasn't good. She blinked and put the coffee cup down as she asked, Wait, what? Sophie sighed and she stared at her like Emily was a science experiment as she said, Michael wanted to talk to Dane, but he left before breakfast. If her sister saw into her soul, she'd see how completely she'd messed up her life. Entirely. Dane hadn't done anything to her for her to be so brittle and hard. She stood from the bed but the whip of the comforter knocked her coffee cup to the floor. Sophie said, Dane checked out of the hotel. Oh no. She'd screwed up. Emily hurried to the bathroom and found a towel to clean up her mess. She returned, knelt down and shook her head. Oh, Sophie, that's my fault. Emily came beside her but stopped her from mopping the floor as she held her wrist lightly. How? What did you do? I broke up with him. Sophie picked up the pieces of her broken porcelain cup. This was exactly like her life, screwed up and broken. Emily fit the small pieces into the shell that remained as her sister asked her, "You what? We broke up?" She knelt next to her cup that reflected her life. She couldn't face her sister as heat rose in her cheeks. Sophie took the cup and tossed it in the metal trash can. Why? The last person that might understand stared at her. To Sophie, the world was bright and beautiful and sweet and kind. Her sister never saw anything bad in anyone or anything. Emily stood and let out a long sigh as she said, "Because it wasn't going to work out and it was only a matter of time until it ended anyhow. I couldn't look at him and just wait for that shoe to drop." Sophie tilted her head and stared at her like she belonged in a mental institution for admitting the truth. Because he ran off after prom? Boom, she'd hit the nail on the head. How do you know about that? I'm your sister. Sophie breezed across her hotel room and opened the closet to reveal navy blue pants and a blue and purple top that Emily would have chosen for herself. Emily followed, though her heart had sunk into her stomach. I never said a word to you or anyone. Her sister shrugged and took out the shoes she'd clearly bought for her as she said, "We have tracker apps on our phones. We knew you were together." Emily's eyes widened and instead of being angry she realized she had a way to find Dane. She leapt toward her pocketbook and said, "The app? What?" Sophie batted her eyelashes. Emily dug out her phone and saw the blue dot headed toward Paris. Her heart soared. She'd apologize right away for being a stupid fool. Her lips still tingled from his kisses and she'd made a huge mistake when she'd listened to her doubts. Stupid was clearly her middle name. She put her phone down and met her sister's gaze as she said, "I need to go find Dane." Sophie walked over to her and took her wrist. "If he left because you broke up with him, he probably doesn't want to see you right now." Her mouth went dry as her skin buzzed. This wasn't good. She swallowed and only wanted to say I'm sorry to him, but... Her sister stayed in front of her with her arms crossed. "But what? You broke up." Emily's eyes began to water. She sniffled to stop the tears but she shook her head and swallowed back her bitterness. "He thinks I broke up with him because of the jewelry. I don't want him to get killed over a necklace or the badge and star that he wants to return to England. We can all just go home and forget." Sophie dropped her hands. Before they left, Jack talked to Henry, and... Emily interrupted her sister. Sophie tugged her earring and looked out the window toward the bright sky as she said, "Henry did say they were going after Alexander and this time they are working with British and French authorities. Dane had put himself in danger. This wasn't good." Her stomach was in knots. She ignored how her skin buzzed with regret. Last night she'd been tired and emotional. "I have to go." Sophie jumped in her way again and her gaze seemed to penetrate Emily's soul. "Why? If you don't love Dane, then come home with us." The words burned into her skin and lungs worse than the salt water yesterday. She choked out her best defense with one word. "Love?" "Yeah." Sophie shrugged and then continued to hammer home her point with every syllable. "I mean, why hurt him even more if you aren't in love with him?" The soles of Emily's feet burned but the heat pushed higher and higher into her body as she shuffled. This wasn't fair. Emily turned away and her hands curled into fists as she said, "It's not just about him though. I can't just give him my heart and think that everything will be okay." Sophie patted her on the back and her hands were cold to the touch, causing Emily to jolt as Sophie said, "My dad hardly said a word about our mom's death. Our mom had horrible taste in men but that doesn't mean we have to follow in her footsteps." True. Dane had asked her to move in with him and give them a chance. Sophie was happy with her husband, though Sophie patted her stomach and Emily asked, "What does that mean, Soph?" Sophie's face turned red like a pepper as she blushed. "I love Michael and he loves me too." Something else was happening to her sister but right now Emily kept imagining Dane out there. She needed to tell him she'd been wrong. "How do you know he won't leave you eventually?" Sophie came closer and whispered like she shared a secret. "I trust in love, and besides, we're having a baby now." "Oh." Emily's eyes widened as she glanced at her sister's flat stomach. "You're pregnant?" Sophie bit her lip like she was still a teenager herself as she nodded and said quietly, "Yeah. Once Abigail finishes high school, I won't have anyone left to boss around." This meant Emily would be an aunt. She could buy all the loud, obnoxious presents. A giggle escaped her lips as she took her sister's hand. "Soph, you never bossed me around." Her sister then mirrored their mother's disappointed with life look. "I will if you chase after Dane and you don't love him." Emily wished their mom was there in that moment. The 10 years didn't seem so long, but she swallowed and her shoulders slumped as she said, "Soph, I was tired and scared last night." Her sister patted her on the back. "Agreed, you hurt Dane." "Ouch." She glanced up as she said, "I was trying to protect my heart." Her sister didn't move but asked, "So you broke his?" Emily's heart plummeted and she now knew that being empty and wrong was worse than hungry and cold. "You think I did that?" Sophie sounded sad as she said, "I didn't talk to Dane directly, but I bet that's why he left." Wow, she'd been wrong, beyond wrong. Emily picked up her ruined shoes from yesterday and threw them on her feet. Somehow she needed to get to Dane and apologize. "Sophie, I need to go now." Her sister sighed and removed a key from her pocket, holding it out for her as she said, "I rented you a car, clean up. If you do kiss and make up, you'll want fresh breath and clean clothes." Emily took the keys and then pulled her sister into a hug. "Sophie, yeah?" Forgiveness was step one, or at least asking for it, and Emily twisted her hands in front of her and lowered her head. "Thank you for taking me in when our mom died. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't." Sophie smiled and massaged her shoulder as Emily looked up. "We're sisters. Now go and find the man you love before it's too late, and tell him you were stupid. Actually, if you can video record when you admit you were wrong, I'd like a copy." Another laugh escaped her throat. Her sister believed in love. Emily had always known that about Sophie. But maybe her sister had been right all these years. Heat seemed to emanate from her cheeks, but Emily shook it off as she said, "Stop." "It's true," Sophie said. Emily headed into the bathroom. "I'm not that bad," Sophie laughed. "Yeah, and poison helps you lose weight." "Hey," Emily held her stomach and hoped the little tremors were just butterflies. She brushed her teeth. If she loved Dane, then she'd made a huge mistake. The thought made her slightly queasy. If love existed at all, then she'd really done a great job killing any possibility with the one guy who'd always made her happy. Perhaps in not telling Dane she'd pushed him away, and if she didn't tell him now, then she'd never be able to face herself in the mirror. Sophie pointed toward the hairbrush and said, "Hurry, Em." Right. Now she'd chase Dane and tell him. She finished brushing her teeth. Her sister headed to the door. Emily splashed her face with water and said, "I'm on it. I love you." "Good, because I love you too, sis." Sophie blew a kiss like they were still children on her way out the door. Not 2 minutes later, Emily was also out the door, grabbing a croissant for the road from the hotel lobby. She wouldn't take the time to stop. Once she caught up with Dane, she'd tell him and never let him go again. What she felt inside her had to be love, which meant she'd been wrong. She'd get to Dane and then figure the rest out. Chapter 17. Dane ended the call with the Paris police. He waited at the closed ticket stand of the Eiffel Tower as confused tourists were turned away. The police had kept their passports, so neither Dane nor Henry could go anywhere. An officer gave them a signal to head toward the elevators. Guess it was time to find out what was going on with Alexandre Mazet and his jewels. He nodded at Henry that they were set. Early this morning, Dane had received a call that the authorities had tracked Alexandre to the Eiffel Tower after he'd left his hotel room. Dane would need to identify the thief and the jewelry. Without Emily, Dane's heart clenched in his chest when he thought of her and how things had ended. At least she wasn't here though. She was safe, with Michael, away from danger. After he returned her necklace, he would never see her again. She'd been clearer than a diamond last night, and he was ever the fool, falling in love with a woman who didn't love him back or trust him. Henry walked beside him toward the ride to the top of the Eiffel Tower as the Paris police guided people away. Once the tourists were safe, he and Henry headed up. The air was fresh this morning. The ride tilted and followed the path of the tower. As a young boy, he'd hidden behind his mother, but the man he thought was his father pushed him toward the edge and told him that men looked poor. The memory faded as the doors opened. The cool morning air made him feel more alive, despite the lack of sleep from the night before. He and Henry walked around the deck until they found the man they sought. Henry stayed behind a pole and Dane took a step forward as he said, "Alexandra." The man turned around, a cigarette puffing at the corner of his mouth. Dane's nose itched from the smell as Alexandra said, "I hadn't expected to see you again, Uriel Dalligatti. You never chased after Ted like this. There'd never been anything worth dying over before." Emily's involvement had changed things. He faced Alexandra, hoping the bulletproof vest under his clothes didn't make any strange sounds as he lifted his hand in greeting. You have my property and I want it back. Alexandra showed the Irish crown jewels in the palm of his hand and said, "Come get it." Dane didn't move. He noted the bulge in the man's left pocket, which must be Emily's jewelry. Alexandra dropped his cigarette and stepped on it to put it out. "We'll be here all day if you don't trust me." "Okay." Dane inched closer and reached for the jewels, wondering when to ask for the necklace too. When Alexandra grabbed his arm and twisted him in a headlock as he said, "Did you think I would turn over so easily?" The bulletproof vest made him heavier. Dane remembered his wrestling days and used his legs to knock Alexandra over him and throw a punch to get him off. Dane pinned him and said, "Actually, yes. The police are at your apartment with your wife and child." Alexandra stopped moving in surprise, then sat on the ground in defeat. "The police?" Dane stood and wiped the dirt off his jeans. "They intend to arrest you for Vet Sand's murder." Alexandra also got to his feet. Dane saw Henry behind the pillar, his gun drawn. "Good." Dane held out his palms again to demonstrate he wasn't a threat while Alexandra said, "He was going to kill your girlfriend. I protected her, it was defense." "Right." The undercover officer Dane noticed reached for the man's pocket on his shirt to get Emily's set and pulled out the necklace and earrings, though Alexandra backed up with all the jewels. Dane said, "Friends don't steal jewelry. If you hand over the Irish crown jewels though, Henry and I will testify for you. You did save Emily." Dane, once he had his personal property back, would offer it to Emily as a goodbye gesture. Alexander said, "Now that is a problem." "Why?" Dane motioned with his hand to return the jewels. Alexander backed into another pole near him and realized he couldn't back up anymore. He bowed. "I cannot give you the badge and star. Would you work out a deal for just the necklace?" His necklace went to Emily and the English authorities wanted the stolen crown jewels for their museum. Dane shook his head. "I can't." Alexander crossed his arms. "The silly ornamental pieces are worth my life. If I don't deliver, I'd only delay death." At least the thug didn't have a gun or he hadn't shown it. "Look, I've talked to the French and British authorities for hours to get you a deal. If you turn evidence against whoever your buyer is, not only will the murder charges be dropped, we can get you into a witness protection program." The elevator dinged. The authorities must have thought time was up. Alexander heard it too as he pulled out his own handgun and pointed it at Dane. "Not good enough." A second later, Emily's voice raised across the roof. Uriel, there you are." Every cell in his body pumped with alarm. What was she doing here? Her face glowed like a celestial angel, her blonde bob a halo on this still dark dawn. She was supposed to stay with her family. Her eyes widened. He turned as she ran right for him, and Alexandra. He jumped in front of her. "Emily, not now." Emily pressed her hand on his hip and said, "Yes, now." Alexandra pointed his gun toward Emily. "So glad you could join us, Miss Mira." Dane inched in front of her. He had a vest. She was vulnerable. Emily sucked in her breath. "Alexandra, I had no idea you were here. Just stay back, Em." Dane slightly pushed her toward Henry. Emily stepped back but kept her eyes on Dane, who stayed in any potential bullet's path as she said, Uriel, I'm sorry for everything I said." Alexandra headed to the staircase, his gun out and aimed at Dane. Henry would have to leave his spot to get a shot now, but Dane refused to move, not while Emily was a target. Alexandra took another step as he said, "She's sorry, now why don't we all go our separate ways?" The police were downstairs. Hopefully this would be over. Dane held out his hand. "Alexandra, before you go, I'd like my mother's jewelry." "Your father was Edmund Pearce." Alexandra took another step. Technically no, but Edmund was the man that haunted his nightmares as his father. "Yeah, I thought he was my father." Alexandra reached behind him for the door as he asked, "Did your father have relatives, Mr. Dalligatti?" The Pearce family consisted of an uncle and a great-aunt. Neither wanted anything to do with him since they'd contested his father's will, but Dane still inherited Edmund's wealth. During that brief year, he depended on Michael to pay for his boarding school. Why does that matter? Alexandra threw open the door behind him, making a huge bang sound as the metal hit metal. "You asked who the buyer is that wants these trinkets. If your father were alive, would he be a force to cross? Would you trust the police to protect you?" His fake father had his real father imprisoned and tortured for a crime he hadn't committed. Dane winced and motioned with his hand for Alexandra to drop the gun. "You can trust me though. Edmund never broke my biological father. We can help you if you help us." Alexandra ran into the elevator bank, but as the door closed, a bullet sound reverberated through the air. Dane said a silent prayer as he waited for impact. Nothing hit him though. The elevator closed as Emily screamed, "No!" Dane turned around. Emily slumped to the ground. A young undercover officer from earlier with a weapon was being reprimanded by his superiors that came to investigate the shots. Henry spoke to someone on the phone in urgent tones about an accidental shot. Dane dropped to his knees, lifting up her head as he said, "Emily, what did you do?" She cupped his chin and patted his cheek as tears ran out of her eyes. "Dane, I love you. I was stupid and wrong last night. Forgive me." Everything she'd wounded, everything he'd tried to bury inside his soul last night, all melted in his heart. He squeezed her hand. "Where are you hurt?" She tried to lift her leg opposite him but winced in pain. "My leg is numb." He twisted around her and scanned her body for other injuries too. "Let me see." The bullet meant for him had hit her. Henry called out, "An ambulance is coming, we should get her downstairs." Dane reached under her and lifted her as Henry pressed the button for the elevator. Emily hugged his waist. "Why did you come here, Dane?" Hadn't she seen? Dane leaned against the elevator wall as Henry pressed the button and let the wall hold some of Emily's weight as he shifted and took out her necklace. He handed it to her as he said, "I got your necklace back because you wanted it. Sorry about ripping your pants. I think being shot was the biggest problem," she said in her usual backhand voice. But then she clutched the necklace and cried into his shoulder. "I want you. I don't care about the pants." Her words made the walls around his heart fall. The doors opened and he said, "Then Emily Mira, for once you're going to have to trust me." "Trust you?" Police sirens sounded all around them. Henry pointed toward Alexandra, who was in a standoff against the police. Dane kept a brisk pace to get her toward the ambulance and said so only she could hear him, "Yeah. I'm not going to let you die." "Good, because I don't want to die." She mustered a smile for him. Either she was numb to pain right now or she wasn't hurt that bad. As they neared the ambulance, Dane motioned with his head toward his friend and said, "Henry, get the ambulance door." Paramedics took over and led Emily to a stretcher, but she refused to let go of his hand and dragged him inside the ambulance with her. "How bad is my leg, Dane?" She tried to give the jewelry back, but he pushed the necklace toward her. "Emily, hold on to this necklace. You hold it for a while." She leaned back on the stretcher as paramedics checked her out. Again she smiled at him, though she clearly had pain, as she said, "Dane, answer my question." Henry waved at him as the paramedics closed the ambulance door and drove them to a hospital. Dane had no answer until he overheard the paramedic in the passenger seat speak to his colleague, the driver. Dane only understood, "Balarase, good." His horrible French meant the bullet had grazed her skin. Emily would be fine. He kissed her hand and said, "You got lucky. The bullet missed out on all your bones and arteries. But a doctor is going to have to check for sure. We'll find out more after you're examined." She nodded. More police sirens grew louder. But right now Dane didn't care. He had Emily here and she was fine. He bowed his head. She broke the silence in the ambulance and asked, "Dane, 1 minute." He scooted closer. She touched his tight jaw. "I trust you because I love you. Please forgive me for last night. I was wrong and stupid and I never meant to hurt you like that. I'm so sorry." Wow, he'd never heard her apologize for anything before. He shifted a blonde strand of hair from her cheek. "Don't worry about anything, but next time when you're overtired, just close your eyes." He pressed his forehead to hers, their hands clasped. As the ambulance pulled into the hospital lot, she let him go. "Thank you for getting my necklace back. Keep it until we're out of the hospital. I finally changed my bra." He laughed. He hadn't meant to, but Emily's joke broke through the fog. The paramedics opened the ambulance and wheeled her out on the stretcher. He followed and walked beside her, holding her hand as he said, "When you're better, you and I will talk to my father together about my uncle stealing my treasures." "Is that who is behind it?" She tried to sit up, but the paramedics were clear she needed to lay down. "I'll be beside you for as long as you need me." The automatic doors opened for them. He stayed next to her as they were wheeled inside. "Emily Mira, you drive me crazy. It's part of why I've always loved you." Her face drained of color, but she held his hand tighter. As long as Emily made it through, nothing else mattered. He needed her in his life. Chapter 18. The 4 white walls of her private hospital room drove her crazy. She needed to move and see people, color, trees outside. Anything but the same walls and the unending white light from the beaming bulbs above her head that left no shadow anywhere. Emily squatted on her leg and tried to stand with one leg up on her other. Exercise was her only calm here. When she was alone, she was going to be just fine. The last thing anyone was going to do was hold her down ever again. though the bandages on her legs made her poses awkward. Dane just shook his head as he watched her from the corner armchair. At least he was awake now, so they could converse. Talking was perfect. Someone knocked on the door and he stood, tucking his phone in his back pocket. As the door opened, she smiled and waved as Dane came beside her and gently pushed on her knees so she'd put her leg down as he said, "Henry, Brady, come in." Brady had metal wraps around his fingers. She winced for him, but at least he took care of himself, which was better than Dane. Dane acted like he was never hurt. Emily hobbled onto her bed, grateful that the bullet hadn't punctured her leg. It had grazed her skin, the melting metal hot and fast, but it could have been a whole lot worse. Henry closed the door and Brady took a seat on one of the visitor chairs against the wall of her hospital room as he asked, "Have either of you heard the news?" Emily scooted to the edge of the bed as they waited for discharge papers. Dane stayed next to her and asked, "No, what's going on?" Henry guarded the closed door like a sentinel. "Alexandra's been caught. The French police will be returning your property to you. The British royal family have extended you both an invitation to Buckingham Palace." She yelped with joy. Everyone glanced at her, but she didn't care. Staying with Michael was nice, but to actually meet the Queen, she would need a dress for the occasion. What was the protocol when invited to the palace? She had no idea, but the hum in her veins only grew stronger. She'd absolutely look it up. Her smile widened. "We'll see the Queen? I'm so excited." "Emily looks well." Brady nodded. "Guess that was all it took." Dane hugged her. The bullet grazed her skin but didn't pierce through her in any way, because her boyfriend had saved her life. She had a bounce inside her that didn't allow her to sit still. "Doctor wanted to release me right away, but Dane convinced them to keep me overnight, which is why we're still here and waiting to go now. The nurse said I'll be up to speed in a week or two." Both men nodded at her. Dane let her go but asked, "Henry, can you ask Buckingham to hold off for 2 weeks so Emily can walk?" Now she had even more reason to heal fast. And maybe she could write a paper on the Irish crown jewels for a history journal. No one would have a better story than her on this one. Researching the past and putting it together with the known facts of now would weave quite a tale. She'd have to figure out what happened, when the box was opened last, when the Paris and London accounts were founded, how the jewels had survived 2 world wars. Basically, she had tons of research, which she loved. Henry nodded, of course. Her mind buzzed as Brady then said, "Your father called a few minutes ago. He wanted permission to come see you both." Now she stilled, waiting. If Michael had called, then it was up to Dane on how he wanted to proceed. Hopefully he wouldn't want to disappoint her family, but she'd deal with her sisters no matter what. Dane's decision mattered, so she glanced up at him with support. He told Henry, "Can you book us rooms at a hotel and tell my father we'll meet him for dinner?" "Good." She used his hand to stand, then his arm as a crutch. "Really?" Brady fixed his glasses with his left hand, stood from his seat and waved at them as he said, "We'll leave you two alone." They didn't talk as Brady and Henry filed out. She swallowed and patted the bed beside her. Dane sat once the door closed. She waited for him to say something, but he was silent, so she broke the moment with a sigh. He kissed her hand. "You said you'd be beside me when I see my father again." She kissed his cheek and rested against his shoulder. "I didn't know you'd just forgive like you did. Thank you, Dane." Another knock sounded, so she held back the rest of what she wanted to say. It was the nurse with the paperwork so she could leave. "Yeah." She jumped as the door closed behind the nurse. Dane picked up her pocketbook and handed it to her as he asked, "Was I supposed to hold a bad night where we were both exhausted against you?" "I don't know." She took his hand and squeezed as she said, "Let's just get out of here. The doctor said I'm not bleeding and don't need stitches." He walked beside her and reached for the door as he said, "You were lucky." She bounced into the hall, though she knew tomorrow once the pain meds wore off she'd feel more pain. She limped a little as they headed out, and the memory of Dane chasing Alexandra came to mind. She winked at him as they made it to the elevator banks. "No, not luck, you were blocking him. I couldn't let anything happen to you." He pressed the button. They were alone, though nurses and patients walked in the halls around them. She met his gaze and only focused on him as she said, "And it seems you won." As the doors opened, he patted her back and said, "We won. Do you want the necklace back now?" She pressed the button for the ground floor and showed him her back. "Put it on my neck, please." He wrapped it around her neck but struggled with it as his hands trembled. "I'm still not good with the clasp." Still? He'd been fine before. Something else bothered him clearly, but right after he said it, like magic, he secured the gold necklace around her neck. She turned and took the earrings from his hand. "You're a good man, Dane, it's part of why I love you." He kissed her forehead and held her steady for a moment. She sighed as the doors opened. He took her hand and they walked together through the busy lobby and out into the sun. Henry had been waiting for them and pointed them toward a car as Dane's phone dinged. He checked the message and told Emily, "It seems my father sent us a car." Emily followed him, but then waited while he checked the driver's identification. Once he was sure, he signaled for Emily to get in first. Then he did. Once he sat beside her, she turned her knees into his and said, "Let's see Michael. You'll feel better if you do." "I feel fine right now." He met her blue eyes. She let out a small sigh and said, "If anyone understands loss, it's your father. You're both alike." Michael. To Dane, he seemed so aloof and uncaring about everything. After his mother died, Dane remembered staying in Michael's house as his father's uncle flat out refused to see him. In the following years, Michael had kept his distance. Emily and her sisters had been kind. He blinked and said, "I don't see it." Emily took his hand while they drove into Paris. "You wouldn't. Oh, and let's not get upset. My sister is pregnant." Michael and Sophie seemed like total opposites back when he was in high school, and even now he didn't see how they fit, but it wasn't up to him to choose. Now that Emily was beside him, Dane relaxed and met her gaze. "I'm getting a brother or sister." "Yeah," she nodded and said, "I'm so excited for both of them." Emily was a source of light itself. She smiled at him and he already felt his body loosen. He scooted closer and asked, "Emily, yeah?" She gazed up and narrowed her eyes at him. Now that this was over, their lives could be normal. He stilled as he asked, "Will you move in with me when we go home?" Without hesitation, she nodded like she'd just found her favorite new present under the Christmas tree. "I'll be wherever you are, Dane." "Good." He sank back against the leather seat. Emily was the one woman he'd ever met who was honest and sweet and forthright and smart, and he loved her. As they headed toward the hotel, she stopped humming to herself and asked, "Can I ask a question?" He raised a brow. "Can I ever refuse you?" "Well, no, you can't," she said with a laugh, but then became more serious. She lowered her voice. "Anyhow, why did you choose the name Uriel? It's unusual." When he'd left Miami years ago, he'd wanted to be someone else, and his grandmother's prayers echoed in the back of his mind. He traced Emily's arm. "Did you ever read the Bible, Em?" "I read it and liked it, but I haven't memorized much." Her gaze seemed puzzled as she asked, "Was there a Uriel?" "I don't remember that name. Uriel is one of the 4 archangels in my grandma's teaching." He let the memories of childhood wash over him. His mother's mother used to take him for ice cream and sometimes to church whenever his parents needed time off to go and do something. Emily hugged her stomach as the driver stopped in front of the hotel. The driver stepped out and she asked, "So you wanted to be an angel?" The driver opened the door and she scooted out. Once Dane joined her on the sidewalk, he said, "No, but he's the angel of repentance and supposedly stands at the gates with his fiery sword to cast demons out of heaven. My father Edmund was an evil man. I've spent my adult life trying to carve out my own path and not to define myself as Edmund's son. I return lost items to their rightful owners, figure out clues and solve ancient mysteries that time forgot. But I always wanted to be honorable and show a little respect to my mother's mother, who liked to teach me right or wrong before she died." "Your grandmother sounds lovely." She walked slowly beside him as they went inside. They headed toward the front desk together to check in as he said, "When my mom died, I always prayed she'd repented and joined Grandma. Edmund might torture my dreams, but it's mostly because my mom died how she did. And I don't want her to be punished. She was my mom." Emily traced his cheek as the clerk called them to come forward. "So you chose Uriel as your name?" "Yeah." He led her to the front desk. He signed for the room and took the key, handing her a plastic card that she slipped into her pocket. They glanced around the lobby toward the restaurant. Emily pointed toward it and he nodded. It was time. He pressed his hand on her lower back and said, "We're here. Let's go see Michael." They took 2 steps, but then she stopped and said, "Dane, 1 second." "What?" He stood beside her, waiting to find out what she wanted to say. She held both of his hands to her heart. "If you want, I'll call you Uriel, if that makes you feel better." Emily. Somehow she made everything smoother. Her eyes were bright and she'd always be his personal angel. He patted her hand and said, "I like hearing you call me Dane. You make being the old me, well, tolerable." She made a face like she didn't like his answer and asked, "Tolerable?" "Yes." He leaned down, claiming her lips in a kiss. Emily's kiss was unlike any other woman's, sweeter than champagne or any fruit he'd ever had. She had something inside her that burned into him, and he hugged her, holding her tight, forgetting where they were. However, she ended the kiss too fast, and behind him he heard the distinctive cough of her sister Sophie. Emily sighed and said, "I guess that's okay. There is Michael at the door, waiting for us." His neck felt hot. Hopefully the past was now gone, but to ensure his sanity he quickly whispered to Emily, "Stay next to me. Always." He held her hand but then extended the other as he neared the dark-haired man that was technically his father. "Hi Michael, it's good to see you again." Michael patted his shoulder and smiled at them as he said, "You too, son. Both of you come in, we've had dinner prepared." As they entered the dining room, Emily held her breath and then squealed, "Dane, my sisters are here too." The two younger sisters had clearly grown up. Isabel must be in college now and Abigail was a full-grown teenager. He remembered her when she was little. "Then it's a reunion for all of us." For once in his life, Dane saw them all together and wasn't haunted from his long-ago past. Emily made the future bright enough to simply be happy. Chapter 19. The limo stopped before Buckingham Palace. Dane hadn't even glanced out the window once the entire drive. Beside him, Emily bounced, clearly excited as she squeezed his hand. Today he wanted to make Emily proud. She wore the set he'd given her years ago to meet the Queen. He adjusted the back so it laid flat against her neck as the car stopped. He peeked out and saw they were in the driveway. The tannish walls of the palace were so high he didn't have a proper view. Not that the location mattered. He checked the ornamental pieces. The jewels that had been missing for over 100 years were now being returned. Soon everyone would see the Irish crown jewels on display at the Tower of London. Museums allowed the world to experience the past, and this journey was now done. This time he was no longer alone. Emily was at his side and nothing could be better. Dane adjusted his blue tie to ensure it was straight. Emily patted his shoulder. They waited for the driver, dressed in black livery, to open the door for Emily and himself. Emily's light blonde bob shone and her pastel green gown only made her necklace glitter more. She adjusted her dress and shifted her weight back and forth, fiddling with the necklace he'd given her in high school. In heaven he hoped his mother and grandmother smiled down and appreciated Emily. She took his hand and he whispered, "Emily, you look great." She shook her head as they walked up the steps as invited guests. "I'm terrified of going into the palace." Near the door, the guards opened them ceremonially and they were expected to know all the procedure. He swallowed, clutched her hand and offered a reminder. "We were told, walk to the throne, hand the jewels to the servant, bow and back up, never showing the Queen your back. You made me practice this morning. You will do great." She took a deep breath and nodded, though she held onto his arm with her other hand as they stepped inside the gilded lobby. "I did, but that's not what's terrifying me right now." He leaned closer and ignored that a butler in red came toward them. Emily smelled like roses in her perfume, and somehow he was drawn even closer to her as he asked, "What is it then?" She stared at his polished black shoes instead of his eyes. "I said I wanted to be proud of you, but the truth is that I was scared our lives would never be normal. After visiting the palace, will you be happy with just writing journals about our one trip we might officially take a year?" She must know how special she was. He traced her back until she looked up at him, and then he said, "Our trip might be months long, discovering the past. That brings me joy. I want to see you happy as well." "I am happy, Dane." She fixed his tie for him. "I get to be beside you and I know more about the significance of history and get to write about your finds in addition to my own." They made a dynamic team. Dane had intended to ask her over dinner, but as royal guests filed past for the ceremony, Dane's mind quieted them all out, and the box in his pocket almost burned him. He took it out while he said, "Well, I know nothing can eclipse our day, but I wanted to ask you a question." He went down on one knee. Emily's face flamed red. She covered her lips. "What's going on, Dane?" He opened the box and showed her a diamond ring made to match her necklace. "I'd like you to move in as my fiancée, Emily." She dropped her hand but squeezed his. "What are you saying?" He stood but didn't let her go. "I love you and don't want to spend another minute of my life without you at my side." Tears ran down her face as she asked, "Are you serious right now?" "Yes." "Will you marry me?" Emily was perfect and he wanted forever to start, now. She threw her arms around his neck and bounced up and down as she said, "Yes, yes, yes." "Here." He slipped the ring on her finger. She sighed and wrapped her arms around him. He leaned forward and quickly kissed her despite the tap of shoes that it was time for them to keep moving. As the kiss ended, she sighed and said, "Now this really is the best day, ever. I love you, Dane." He winked at her and then walked at her side. So let's drop off the jewelry and get out of here. I'm all yours, she marched proudly beside him. And even if she thought nothing might top this day, she was wrong. Every day with Emily at his side was a taste of heaven. Life couldn't get better than that. Thank you for reading. I hope you enjoyed Dane and Emily as much as I did. If you want to stay with my action-adventure romances, the next up is Jack, who was Michael's butler in this and the first book. So be sure to grab Jack now. Or if you're in the mood for a family series where the brothers were all falsely accused of crimes and they need to find out what happened, I'd grab Irresistibly Charming for free and find out how Hannah springs Logan from jail when she agrees to marry him. Or you can read about a short story series of billionaires all being targeted, and you start the Tempting series with Tempting Gabe for free. And to find out about new books, sign up for my newsletter, https with victoriapinder.com. About the author. USA Today best-selling author, Victoria Pinder grew up in Irish Catholic Boston, then moved to Miami. Eventually found that writing is her passion. She always wrote stories to entertain herself. Her parents are practical-minded people demanding a job. But when she sat down to see what she enjoyed doing, writing became obvious. Visit my website and download a free novel, www.victoriapinder.com. Victoria@victoriapinder.com.